not about who's in power. It's who they think is in power.
So if we let them vote, they think they're in charge.
It is one of the most important in the life of our nation.
You know, this is the most important election of our lifetime, no matter how young or old you are. Not a joke, not hyperbole, it's not Democrat, Republican.
I think this election, I think it's the most important election of our lifetime.
There's an election coming up this November, and it's the most important election in the modern history of our country.
5 days to go, and until the most important elections in our lifetime. And that's not hyperbole. It's going to shape what the next two generations look like.
This is the most important election in the history of our country.
This election is the most important in the modern history of this country.
3 days until the most important election of our lifetimes. And that includes mine, which was pretty important.
The election in 2020, without hyperbole, is going to be the most important election this country has undergone in over 100 years. Not a joke.
I believe this is the most important, and this is not rhetoric, I truly believe this is the most important election in our lifetime.
This November's elections are more important than any I can remember in my lifetime, and that includes when I was on the ballot.
There are just 8 days left in what is the most important election of our lifetimes.
This will be maybe the most important election that our country's ever had.
There's never been a more important tomorrow in modern electoral history in the United States than tomorrow, and that's not hyperbole.
We know what is on the line and what is a truly most important election of our lifetime. Has anybody ever said that to you before?
Welcome to Health Revealed, Part 2. Thank you for joining us as we delve deeper into the solutions, those new models that we can absolutely create, combating those old models, those old systems that we see are not working for us. Many people may understand the problems, right? But what are those solutions? And maybe they're easier to understand when we get past all the confusion that we identified last time. A lot of confusion, a lot of things that are happening. It makes people say, oh my gosh, I don't know what's happening. I guess I should just continue doing what I'm doing, right? And oh, it's inevitable and there's no way we can change it. But clearly, there's a lot of research on this, a lot of people leaving the system. There is hope, there is inspiration, and I thank you for joining us. And I'm joined here by Stephanie Mo Davis, Leslie Powers, and Scott Gordon. Thank you guys. If you want to say hello.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello, glad to be here.
All right, so talking more about money, because of course this is a big concern in healthcare, there are hidden costs, right, that we're talking about. I mean, there's hidden costs of deaths, of a lot of things that we're not necessarily looking at. Well, what is the hidden cost of statism, this idea that we are identifying here? And of course, it relates to the government. Well, Dr. Joseph McCullough says the government controlling healthcare is a core problem. Politicians have stepped in to dictate patient care, which doesn't allow physicians to practice medicine and save patients' lives. Right now, again, this is a practitioner, and you can look him up if you want. And, you know, he's going to be seen as this controversial figure because he's one of the people on our list of individuals who kind of left the medical system and is doing his own practice. So ask yourself the question, why? And how does what he's saying relate to this idea of a free market? He says lack of data transparency at the CDC between the FDA and Pfizer regarding clinical trial data and about injection side effects registered in a Department of Defense database is putting Americans' health at risk. So lack of data transparency, right? Regardless if you agree with him or not, he's talking about transparency here. Is all the information public? Can people see what is actually being put out there? And do they know about all the different studies on the different drugs that they're taking, for instance? Has there been enough studies on alternative methods that maybe they don't know about? And how does this happen in the very first place? Why is there a lack of transparency?
And I'll add the question, who gets to decide what's shared and what's not? And what is that process? Is that transparent?
And we encourage you, to think over this for yourself. Like I said, you can think of Mercola as you wish. Look at the information that we're sharing here and the quotes that they're providing. Does it have any relevance whatsoever? Well, we have a controlled business of health. He says every facet of government is in the censorship business. And he details throughout his articles that there have been many leaks of problems within the system affirming this, between science and state, between agribusiness, pharmaceutical companies, and politics. There's been leaks that you can look up all on the record. And he says here, personal financial disclosures reveal that more than half of Congress members are millionaires, with a median net worth of just over $1 million. As is often the case, however, the top 10% of the lawmakers in terms of wealth are 3 times richer than the bottom 90%. Now, why is that relevant? We talked about before how some of their donors are these pharmaceutical companies, right? Are these agribusiness companies? And why? What is going on here? Are they seeking protection? Are they seeking a monopoly? Wouldn't you, if you perhaps had that money to use the law to your benefit to ensure that your product gets out there, perhaps even at the expense of others who are trying to share their product or share their solution? And again, these are just questions we're asking, and I encourage you look into some of the points he's making here. So going back to statism and the morality aspect of this, because we're delving more into the psychology. We're not necessarily focused on the economics. I wanted to briefly touch on that because, of course, it's interesting to hear from practitioners and economics experts who are saying, wait, what if we give freedom a try? What if we, defeat all this lack of transparency and censorship? It's very interesting to see that because we see a parallel when we're looking at psychotherapy or psychology, which you'll see with a lot of the researchers that we bring up here. And so we have psychotherapist Nathaniel Branden, who says if there is one infallible test of self-contempt, it is a person's willingness to live under force, his willingness to accept as a moral principle that others have the right to dictate his thoughts and his actions, his willingness to submit his mind and his life to the arbitrary power of a gun. The man who submits to force when he has no choice is not immoral, provided he identifies his plight as evil. But the man who considers it moral, considers it right, that others should force him, deserves what he gets. Very interesting, right? To say the right to do wrong, or essentially, allowing evil to take place. What is going on here? Self-contempt, willingness to live under force, he's mentioning. Part 2, he says, you certainly do not need men who attack you and feed off you as parasites, offering you no value in exchange for that which they take. Is your survival enhanced by living among looters, robbers, criminals? Clearly not. You profit from dealing with producers. You do not profit by dealing with men who instead deal with you by physical force or fraud. And of course, I summarize some of this because he expands in great detail what he means by this. He also says, throughout history, most governments have acted on principles diametrically opposed to their proper function and their only moral justification. For instead of acting as men's defenders, governments have acted as men's oppressors. And do we see a parallel in medicine, where people who are supposed to heal are perhaps contributing to disease? These are the questions we ask, and that's why it may be considered controversial, but it's needed if we want to make the system better. Maybe there's a reason why the prices are rising, why disease is continuing to grow, and if nobody addresses it, who will, right? So perhaps we have a moral obligation to share this knowledge and identify this force and fraud that is taking place that isn't really being addressed. And so, here you have it from a psychotherapist, basically identifying what statism is. People allowing evil and allowing people who attack you. And he says they feed off of you. They don't give to you. They take from you. Well, is the government producing any service? Or is it taking resources from others that have already existed? Right? And is it just transferring resources that already exist from other people? And how do they do it? Part 3. In affirming the points by psychotherapist Nathaniel Branden, Quote, this is from the sociologist Robert Bierstead. I'm not going to say the names correctly, and psychologist Sharon Presley. Quote, he points out that expertise, skill, and knowledge in a particular area is something we are free to accept or not. Authority, however, uses coercion. Authorities are those who have power over us whether we agree to it or not. For example, government bureaucrats or police officers. So again, really in line with what we're talking about here, directly addressing statism and this concept of authority, looking up to certain people. It's okay to say, hey, this person has skill, I want to follow them, but what about the authority figure that claims you have no choice but to follow them, right? And if you don't, you're going to be coerced, and this is what's going to happen to you, and this is what's going to happen to you. If you don't have this certain receipt, if you don't have this certain insurance company or certain drug or all these constraints on people, it's questionable how free they really are.
I just wanted to bring something up regarding coercion and the confusion that we talked a lot about in our last episode, is that not everybody within these models necessarily promotes evil or a willful ignorance. And I think this is what makes it so deeply confusing, is that we're walking this fine line between having to have an incredible amount of mental acuity and discernment to be able to see who is doing what and what really is their true intention amongst these systems of authority. So just for our audience, we're not here to be reductionist or binary in any way. We fully understand that certain providers or therapies or certain policemen are doing the best they can for their, in lieu of protection and in service of what they believe in. It's just that this confusion and this underlying level of manipulation where things start to become so confusing that we no longer can identify the evil amongst it. And then we become confused as to, well, this is all good or bad, because that's how the brain operates. The brain likes to operate in binaries of, well, this is all good or this is all bad. We're walking amongst territory where the two are intermingling in the same space and time. So the level of mental awareness and discernment on everybody's part, people working within the system, to the patients, to the agents, to everybody involved, needs to develop that mental discernment to really understand, is this particular individual working for good, or are they actually somebody promoting evil? So I think a time in history where mentally, our mental awareness is really being called upon to level up, to embody that discernment.
Yeah, Steph, and I'll add that I think it's also calling us to become emotionally aware and to build our emotional intelligence, because these topics, these concepts are triggering. And, notice inside yourself what emotional reactions you're having that may be defending the existing structure or defending the need to have authority. Because this is part of the battle. It's mental and cognitive, it's also emotional. And there's a need for us to be very aware of our own internal process and to manage all of our reactive parts, to then sift through and filter through that, to be able to make sure that our thinking brain is really online, receiving and open, receptive to new ideas.
Mm-hmm. Talking about this new model being multidimensional, if we were going to very simply define that, what's been called forth is not just to embody an academic level of knowledge or expertise in one layer of the human body, which may be physical. It's really understanding that holistic intelligence is what's required moving into the future with the complexities that we face, which is actually an equal measure of not just to be able to embody information on an academic or intellectual capacity, but also to couple that with your emotional literacy and also even having a level of spiritual IQ as well, to be able to see beyond your own bubble. So it's these layers starting to operate together. And Leslie, I couldn't agree with you more about the emotional literacy and the ability to develop response over reaction. So that is a very basic, simple way that you can determine where you're at is, are you reacting? Are you really getting triggered amongst a lot of this information and on social media? Are you finding yourself very out of balance emotionally? That is a clear indication that there's something within you that needs to be deeply addressed. So a higher level of understanding can come forth so you can respond and not react emotionally to everything that you're being seen that goes against your perceived belief system. If you see somebody reacting, it doesn't matter how many PhDs they have. They're not really emotionally literate, right? So that's a good point to really bring up.
It might help to add also why people are drawn to authority. Psychologically, a parent is an authority that's a protector. And people are going to psychologically transfer their trust in that authority into, quote unquote, the authorities, whether that be the doctor, the scientist, or the government. And so that's an important phenomena to be aware of and to understand why it's so widespread a belief. The statism we've been trying to describe and outline is basically a very deep psychological need for those who haven't achieved full independence in their emotional and spiritual maturity. And there's a lot of them. And that goes along with states of bad health. And so a lot of patients are in this condition, and a lot of the population is in this condition, and they're going to accept authority without question.
Brilliant, Scott. The level of codependency that just exasperates from the family system or trauma that somebody's experienced is, the desire to simply be cared for by an authority. And this is another clarion call for us to actually mature as human beings, is to collectively mature in these aspects of not just our intelligence, but our emotions, understanding where we've come from, doing the work of integration, and really starting to allow humanity to grow up. And again, there's nothing more than a system loves than for us to outsource our maturity and sovereignty so they capitalize. So this is very controversial information, but hopefully where we're headed.
Yeah, especially since I would argue the tools of authority have grown over the ages. Now we're moving to an age of AI, so we have to be more careful of this information that we're presenting here is going to become more relevant as time moves on, because the tools and our ability to develop nuclear bombs and to change biology, using technology, we'll talk about a little bit too, is increasing rapidly, where people, if they're not aware of their own sovereignty, things can go south very quickly, unfortunately, with the tools and the technologies that are now being developed. And again, I'm foreshadowing, but we'll talk about that. What I mean by that, I do have concerns, and I think a lot of people have that sort of internal concern of like, whoa, things are moving very fast in many different directions. So perhaps having a bit of grounding would help. So talking about authority figures, what might come to mind is law enforcement. Let's look at the psychology of law enforcement. I know this is considered controversial too, but if we're going to talk about authority figures of any kind, let's talk about the whole of it, right? As practitioners, we want to look at the different aspects and facets of this. So a quote here from the Mises Institute. In 1977, the Police Foundation, a private nonprofit organization dedicated to seeking innovations and improvements in policing, published a study of the San Diego police force entitled Patrol Staffing in San Diego, 1 or 2 officer units. And they said 2 officer units were involved in significantly more citizen complaint incidents per unit than were 1 officer units. Significantly more complaint incidents. as two instead of one. Right? What's going on here with the group dynamic? And there's a term for this called group absolution in law enforcement, and this was identified by combat psychologist Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman. And in similar reference to the findings by the Police Foundation, he refers to the cause of this effect as a group absolution. When people are acting as a group, even as a group of two, there is a diffusion of responsibility. And combat psychologist Ben Shalit expands on this. He says, if aggression exists, it will become more so as a result of crowding. The effect of the crowd seems to be much like a mirror, reflecting each individual's behavior in those around him, and thus intensifying the existing pattern of behavior, thus increasing the dehumanization that transfers men into beasts. The more members in the group, the more psychologically bonded the group, and the more the group is in close proximity, the more powerful the enabling can be. Wow.
Corey, real quick. Two situations arise for me over the last 2 days in regards to a diffusion of responsibility, in particular to medical providers as opposed to law enforcement, but I think it's relevant to mention, is that I spoke to a provider yesterday who was on an airplane with several colleagues going to a conference. And she was mentioning that a lot of them were sitting in first class. And she said, I just thought I would just sit in regular class in the back. And there was a medical emergency on the plane and they had called for a healthcare provider to the scene. And she said that she saw nobody heeding the call. She said she looked up at her colleagues who were closer to the incidents and nobody was moving. So then she said she finally raised her hand in the back and said, I'm a provider. And she was met with a nurse who then stood up. But she said she was so frustrated as to why several of her medical colleagues in the front weren't heeding the call. There was this diffusion of responsibility for some reason. And then just yesterday, there was an incident that I saw on the news regarding one of the recent political rallies where there was a medical emergency in a crowd while about 6 or 7, I believe it was, medical providers were at the microphone talking about some medical issues. There was a medical emergency with somebody in the audience, and they were at the mic saying, is there anybody in the audience who can help this person who's having a medical emergency? And there's public video of this available where there's like 7 providers just standing there at the mic in their white coats, adhering to their responsibility of lecturing to the rally, but none of them moved. And it was like a couple of minutes were going by and they were saying, did anybody help that person? Did anybody help that person? And it's almost as though something is going on. Like you said, I very much see this group absolution and the diffusion of responsibility when you have people that are getting together. There's just they're not acting as they would if maybe they were alone or in their right mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have to delve deeper into this. Is it merely just that it is a group, or is it something more? Does the group dictate, if the individual is going to suppress their conscience? No, not necessarily. As you mentioned, there can be an individual who is courageous, who says, hey, I'm not going to put up with this. I'm going to change something about it. Maybe you have seen scenarios in your own life where, you felt like the need to speak up about something and you were wondering, why is nobody else speaking up? I've certainly had those experiences. And so I'm pretty sure other people have too, in varying degrees. Or maybe you felt like you were part of the pressure and you had to like bend in and you were like, and then you started regretting it after the fact. And a lot of people may have regret, right, for a lot of their actions because they did not act as necessary in the moment where it was necessary.
And we can extrapolate this dynamic to so many things in our world today, where people are seeing wrongdoings occurring in front of their eyes or next door and staying silent and seeing themselves as powerless, or it's not my business.
Mm-hmm.
It's something to think about.
Yeah.
I just want to add something very relevant to what happened to me last night. Was I was able to see a premiere of the movie Bonhoeffer, who was a Nazi resistant pastor, spy, potential assassin. And at the end of the movie, it was so profoundly moving how there was some quotes after Hitler had committed suicide, that the German church stepped up and said, we want to take full responsibility that we didn't speak up when this first started happening. We want to take full responsibility that we didn't do what we were supposed to do when we started seeing this happening. And there was just this beautiful quote of people recognizing that I didn't step up because, you know, that was in reference to lawyers and I'm not a lawyer, or I didn't step up and say something because that was about doctors and I'm not a doctor. But all of these times we had upstream to step up in the face of something that we saw as evil, but didn't do it because we didn't feel like we had righteous authority in that particular moment to speak on behalf of that which it was. But it was just beautiful in the end of that movie how they then said, look, the destruction of what has happened here, we take full responsibility that we had many incidences we could have spoke up in lieu of the truth, and we didn't, and we take full responsibility of that.
Yeah. And it begs the question too, like, who is truly the most responsible here? The person who gives the order or the person who carries out the order, who actually does the action? You know, who bears the most moral guilt? And that person who takes the action, as we saw in the Stanley Milgram experiments, may want to push their responsibility to the person who's telling them to do the experiment. And as we also saw with the Asch conformity experiment, you know, people are willing to say something they know is wrong, that they know is a lie, just because the rest of the other people say it. And so those two experiments are confirming these findings as well. And I encourage you to do the dot connecting on your own as well. I'll help you through this process, but you'll see with a lot of the information we're presenting here, and as we move on, there's a lot of parallels that we found within our research. And so let's solve these law enforcement problems. Unfortunately, Mises Institute mentions, fortunately, there are modest and hardly libertarian proposed reforms to curtail these abuses and other inefficiencies were still too much for the state monopoly, which has effectively zero incentive to address the problems. Many people throughout history, including philosophers like Max Weber and others, have identified the state as a monopoly on violence. Even Elon Musk has said this publicly. So what they mean by that is there really isn't competition with that police force that they have with their law proposals. I mean, if people were free to choose how to live their own lives, perhaps voluntarily, we would not have this monopoly where it says this is the solution, you have to go along with it. These are the people to protect you, and there's nobody else to really protect you. These are the only people who will protect you. I mean, that's a monopoly from my understanding, and there's not really as much competition to keep these systems in check, to make them want to do better, to make sure that they do not become corrupted. And so it's an interesting way of looking at things, right? Coming from, again, bringing it back to the economic point of view.
Corey, when you keep people in fear and in survival and disempowered and financially strapped and medically strapped, and when you keep them in this place of fear and survival, it's not an empowerment model. And it keeps this system running. It keeps this enforcement running the way that it is, because nobody's empowering people to not only shift the way they're operating the system, but also to empower the people who are amongst the victims of the system, right? Where it's just keeping everybody disempowered. The victim model keeps this system profoundly operating, and the control and authoritarianism just continues to elevate because nobody's being empowered to be healthy mentally, spiritually, emotionally.
Yeah, and here you have a researcher who broke it down for us, the brain imbalance of police. So we talked before about the masculine and the feminine, and we figured to share a chart here by an individual. His name is Mark Passio. And he shares a lot of very interesting psychology regarding this belief system, statism, that he actually identifies within his line of work. And he talks about this left brain chronic imbalance and dominance, and then this chronic right brain dominance and imbalance, and the differences between the two. So on the left brain imbalance, you have the the order followers and the psychopaths, and on the right brain, he's saying is the bootlickers and cowards, right? And he breaks it down in his works for the average individual. He's not proposing this for a medical audience, right? But we are obviously supporting this with a lot of psychological ideas and studies. So it's very interesting to see how this can correlate. And he says that garbage attracts garbage. Government itself is a straight line vector for people who are psychopaths, control freaks, bullies, racists, etc., to carry out their desired forms of violence upon others. And the brainwashed public believe these thugs have the right to conduct such violence. And so notice on the left brain, it says there's a lack of empathy. There's that belief in authority, the desire to control others, justify their own violence as a means to an end. Whereas on the right side here talks about how cowards attract garbage. And so as soon as most freedom advocates become afraid that their life might be in danger, suddenly they want the police and National Guard to handle the problem for them. So principles become abandoned at the first sign of trouble, right? It's like, oh, it affects me, so now I gotta I can't speak up, I can't be courageous. And so there's a lack of responsibility. There's also that belief in authority because there's also this desire to be kept safe. Now, notice there's that belief in authority in both worldviews. They're just different points on that same spectrum. And so the right brain is like that weak, passive point of view, and that left brain is like that domineering, you have to do what I say, I want to be in control point of view. And so that right brain may justify violence of others as a means to an end, whereas that left brain says justify their own violence as a means to an end. Either way, at the end of the day, violence is being committed.
Ray, I'd like to just add a tiny bit of nuance. These are two extremes, and there are people that lie between these two extremes. But I do think that the people who even lie between these two extremes witness people within their side in this extreme. So I think that the responsibility right now is I'm tapping into the corpus callosum, which is that center neural tissue between the brain hemispheres, which actually is able to see more holistically. It helps the mind to be more holistic and interconnected rather than so dominant in one end. And ironically, speaking about the masculine and the feminine, the feminine's corpus callosum, which is the space between the brain hemispheres, I believe is 40% larger than in males. They're able to connect between the hemispheres to see holistic intelligence more effortlessly, which is another reason I do believe personally that the feminine psyche and the true feminine aspect is being suppressed. But what I will say, I feel the responsibility is between the people who lie a little bit more balanced between these extremes, is that you have a responsibility. If you can see between both sides and you see the extreme in your domain, to do something about it, to speak out, to try to help, to try to serve, to try to create programming. If you can see, don't just see and not do anything about it. See the extreme and see what you can do about it to provide more of a holistic balance.
You know, it's very natural to desire safety, right? And if you look on the right side of this, that part of the imbalance with this chronic right brain dominance is a desire to be kept safe that basically is on steroids, that's on overdrive because of a feeling of immediate threat to one's survival and to one's security and safety. And so how easily can people be manipulated to feel unsafe or at risk or or threatened, and therefore lose their capacity to problem solve and handle a situation on their own. And then if you haven't been thinking to prepare and thinking about your personal responsibility or self-defense options or developing community and backup to have intrinsically and organically in your world, then people may feel very alone and very reactive to automatically call for the systems that claim to save the day and be those defenders.
You know what, Leslie, again, this can go directed upstream, reverse engineer back, I believe, a lot to the psychology of the parental environment again. is if you felt really unsafe, if you had a family who was not there for you, did not feel cared for, you didn't have your basic needs met, you were in survival mode for the entirety of your childhood, that tends to translate out into adulthood, either subconsciously or consciously, where you're constantly looking to be saved, to be protected, because you didn't have that as a child. And conversely, with the left brain dominance, maybe you were really bullied by your family system. Maybe you were bullied as a kid. So then, in lieu of energy and nature wanting to seek balance organically, that the universe is based off of a model of balancing, you're going to bully to try to reclaim that which you've lost as a child. There's just so much of dysfunction that we see in the world today that I believe just is rooted right back into our primary caretakers and how we were treated as a child.
Yeah, for sure. And if you are raised with a parent that's more on the authoritative side, that's very emphasis and putting a lot of emphasis on following rules, doing what I say, getting in trouble if you deviate from what I say, then that is a training ground for believing in authority and following rules and looking to someone else to keep you safe, rather than thinking upon your own and feeling that it's safe to make your own decisions.
The hardest thing, I think, for all of us to do is to take full responsibility for ourselves, to be able to ask for help when we need it, but to be able to do as much as we can independently without an over-reliance on another person. That doesn't mean become is so independent that you can't ask for help. That's different.
Right.
I think one of the hardest things to do is to take full responsibility for yourself and to have the courage to go against all your entire crowd, your entire system that you're involved in lieu of what's right. And I think that's what's being asked of us right now.
Yes. Well, a question that comes to mind that I want to ask is, do you need that authority to do what is right? Right? Because, when we're talking about police and the nature of it, and you see that the belief in authority is in both hemispheres, and that the chart here says government itself is a straight line vector. Why is that being said here? He's saying a straight line vector to people who are psychopaths, control freaks, and bullies. He's essentially saying the nature of the system is that it's immoral, not that it can be in any way moral. It's because you don't need that authority, that position, that title, or that badge in order to do the right thing, to defend somebody, to help them out. There can be voluntary police. There can be a decentralized free market police system, but perhaps that's just not where we are right now. And it's based on authority.
We don't have the model to support the very wounded. We just don't. And we have adults right now who are very wounded, and they claim they're adults, but they're acting out their childhood psychological dysfunctions. So we just do not have the support and the model to promote a completely voluntary system yet. We just don't. We need a mass healing to occur and people to volunteer to see within them where they're imbalanced, and then have a system to help them recover that before we get to that space.
Yeah, you're already speaking in terms of how we shift this process, which is amazing, because you're going to see here we have charts from Mark Passio more where he delves deep into it. I mean, goodness, look at this detail. But for anybody who's into psychology, this would, I would hope, fascinate you to see. Coming from somebody who's trying to break it down here, what's the difference between an order follower and a psychopath and a bootlicker and a coward in regards to what he says, all police? Now, again, when I say that, I ask that question. Do you need authority to do what is right? In that case, the average person is the policeman. The average person is the doctor. The average person is that scientist, if they choose to tap into that. If we choose to empower individuals to become that, instead of becoming dependent on someone else in a designated position in order that does that. Now, again, not everybody's going to want to be responsible for their whole life. Like Stephanie said, not people don't want to go off grid in the middle of nowhere and, be completely self-reliant. Now, some people might, but I don't. I mean, there's certain things that I know I'm not that great at, and there's certain people who I look up to and say they're fantastic at that, right? But I follow them voluntarily. I don't view them as having more rights than me. They don't have the right to commit violence on others, and that's what we're getting at here. with a lot of these charts. And, Mark uses a very aggressive language, sometimes very direct, because again, his audience is the people directly, and he's got that American Revolution fighting spirit within him. And so it's very interesting to share these charts, and I encourage you to pause if you're interested in this topic and you want to know about what he has to say here.
I think something that's interesting is to consider moving away from this model and really returning to a true civil service model, right? Is this authoritarianism is what's really killing all of us at the end of the day. And yes, unfortunately, we're not at the place where we'd like to be, where everything can be voluntarism, but we have to start somewhere. And I think addressing the psychology and really looking at each and every one of us within the mirror and really assessing ourselves honestly and understanding psychology a little bit has to be a primary indicator of us maturing.
Yes. So let's talk about that. Here is Mark Passio's charts on programming versus deprogramming. So he shares with us his solutions, and we're going to do this once in a while as well. When we bring up different researchers and different scientists and different backgrounds, we're going to say, here's the problems they're identifying, and then the later solutions will be like, here's the solutions that they have to share. Okay, and so here are the solutions that he shares in relation to what he sees are the main methods of manipulation. So he says obfuscation, worldview poisoning, primal fears, divide and conquer, indoctrination, controlled opposition, the financial system, the control of mass media, food and medicine. He has in quotes as if it is not truly food and medicine. The illusion of time, the DHR factor, religion, or anything that's binding upon us, subversive symbolism, and what he calls chaos sorcery. So certainly very interesting topics to delve into. And his solutions are to heal the worldview, to change the quality of our attention, develop true present moment awareness, change our diet, detach from the monetary system, a non-support for dominators, develop mindfulness, the use of entheogens in a conscious context, positive thinking, and helping others to awaken.
And I'll clarify, the DHR factor stands for denial, harassment, and ridicule. So it's the way that perhaps people who are breaking out of the mainstream system of medicine and they're speaking out about their experiences and observations, where those people themselves are targeted with harassment and ridicule, and their experience denied, again, like the gaslighting. So these are things to keep an eye out on and what's happening in the world.
Yes, definitely. Again, if you want to pause and take this in, very interesting to break it down like this, and very cool. This is why a lot of people follow Mark Passio as a content creator online. He has very detailed presentations talking about a lot of these aspects individually in a great amount of detail. Now, let's talk about this idea, because we mentioned it before, this group absolution, or the group polarization that happens in the world and in politics. We have Harvard professor Cassandra R. Sunstein, and she says, my principal purpose in this article is to investigate a striking but thus far almost entirely neglected empirical regularity, that of group polarization, and to relate this phenomenon to a number of issues in law and political theory. In brief, group polarization arises when members of a deliberating group move toward a more extreme point in whatever direction is indicated by the members' pre-deliberation tendency. Like polarized molecules, group members become even more aligned in the direction they were already tending. Group polarization is the conventional consequence of group deliberation. Now, the way this is worded may not be understood completely, but I do try to highlight certain parts. And so politics essentially has become part of our core identity. We fall into certain groups, right? We say, this is who I am, and therefore who I must be in many ways, right? We create all these justifications around that because we want to be right. And then we fall in line with that group, and then we go into that idea of groupthink, which we'll also mention. There's a lot of ways to basically say you're following to conformity, right? Some people call it group absolution, group polarization, group think. There's a lot of terms for this, and we'll talk about that too. I mean, you'll hear about all of it, but very interesting because we see this a lot in the world, which is why some people just don't engage with politics at all. Or a lot of these ideas that we're even mentioning, like we're just mentioning it. Some people won't even talk about it because, oh, it's too controversial. It causes too many fights. It causes so much divide. Well, if that's the case, why? Why do we engage with it like we do? Maybe this divide is not necessary in the very first place. Maybe we can get beyond that divide. We don't just have to ignore politics. Maybe we have to dismiss it willfully in places where, we should say, no, let's just not have this in our lives. Not saying, oh, well, we have to have it, so let's just have this necessary evil take control of our lives. Is there an evil that's necessary? Like, that's a question I would ask to you. If we recognize it as evil, why would we call it necessary? And here you have a chart, we were all humans until race disconnected us, religion disconnected us, politics, wealth, all these different systems. And Dr. Mark Hetherington says, we develop these caricatures of the other side. They're just not like us. And not only are they not like us in politics, they don't drive the right car, they don't drink the right coffee, they don't drink the right beer, they don't eat the right food. It's like a bad relationship. We just don't have anything in common with each other anymore. And again, this is because we're getting so crystallized in our identity that we're unable to just get along with people. Like if you talk to people outside of politics and religion, you might find out, wow, I can connect with them in so many different levels. But then all of a sudden you start mentioning that and it turns into a massive fight and you can't even talk to that person anymore. What's up with that? Why is there such a divide in this world where we can't talk with each other about some of the things we consider to be the most important things too?
Yeah. And what is that phrase when you go to Thanksgiving, don't bring up politics or religion? It's led to this social sort of understanding that we're not even going to bring it up because we don't want to spark an argument. People are pretty conflict avoidant, especially at, holiday gatherings. And so it leads to this further, I think, polarization just by the lack of communication, the avoidance of being uncomfortable in sorting through differences of opinions. It's almost a skill that's been lost in our world.
Yeah, the Socratic dialogue. We don't even have the attention, energy, or bandwidth to debate with somebody that slightly disagrees with us. I watched this podcast yesterday, and this gentleman, Nick Z, had a very interesting question. He said, does voting in this election elect you into the duality and just fuel the machine even more?
That's a powerful quote. Yeah.
Something good to ponder.
Yeah.
And if you look at the root of this, you see what media serves us up all the time. And this relates to the previous slide as well. But the political divide, they offer up the most outrageous and emotional things on one side or the other. And they're not talking about balance. They're not talking about what the other side is actually doing that might be good. So this feeds that polarization. This is why you can't talk politics at Thanksgiving.
Scott, you're right. I believe that really emotional literacy and emotional empowerment is the way that, if you don't embody it, that's the way that they're hijacking us, is they're just deliberately attacking our emotions, which is easy to manipulate anybody when you feed off of their emotions, right? So this is why it's so important for us to do our own work, because you only develop emotional literacy and intelligence by facing that which in you where you are captured and triggered.
Wow.
And then you can ask, how well does the school system teach children how to communicate, how to do conflict resolution, how to think critically, how to have a disagreement? Is a disagreement with a teacher ever even really allowed, or do they get sent to the principal real fast?
Yeah. And again, to connect this to medicine, we're talking about religion, race, all these different things that people consider to be important. Why is there sometimes a dividing line where people say, let's not talk about that? Maybe there's something going on there that we have to say, what's causing people to get prompt upon that mentality? How come when you mention alternative medicine, there's this all of a sudden reaction like, no, there's no scientific evidence for that, or, that's not something that we should do, or, that's all pseudoscience, or that's all something that is just not part of our literature. And it's very interesting to see, right, why the world has become so divisive. And I think people are starting to notice it. And so that, again, prompts us to question, well, what is then that better system? And so let's talk about this idea that can really prompt upon a divide. If somebody's perhaps claiming to be special in the sense of having more rights than another, we've seen that throughout history quite a bit. Where certain cultures, certain races, they say, oh, I'm better than this race or that person, or I'm part of this class must be oppressed. We saw it with slavery. We saw it with Nazi Germany, recent events with different, governments throughout the world. It's pretty alarming. And so here's a quote, and we also have linked a study as well. The more you give certain groups in society special advantages and privileges, from the moral high ground to jobs and salaries, the more this will bring the worst type of people out of the woodwork to take advantage. The science confirms what we intuitively know, that bad people take advantage of other people's good intentions to gain power. The dark triad personalities are narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. The research found that individuals with these three traits are more likely to signal virtuousness or victimhood. The study called Psychopathy by State found that the concentration of psychopaths in Washington, D.C. was far higher than any state. And also a quote here, the presence of psychopaths in District of Columbia is consistent with the conjecture that psychopaths are likely to be effective in the political sphere. And, the dark triad, we have information on that as well that we'll dive into. But this idea of special rights, it goes right in line with what we're talking about with this idea of authority and statism, believing that somebody has more rights than everybody else.
Also coming up in our public sphere is the idea that if you were previously oppressed, then you should be granted special rights now to make up for it. So it's a very controversial claim.
Yes.
There's a wonderful psychologist named Sam Vaknin. I'm sure that you guys have heard of him. He has many videos saying the same thing, the facts that the psychopathy amongst the medical fields, the political sphere, certain circles of power is just highly, highly present. So, yeah.
And virtuousness, victimhood, right? Going back to this idea of the right brain imbalance we talked about before. Somebody saying, man, I'm so weak. I'm powerless. I need power now. It's like they're trying to get that balance. So where are they looking? What are they looking up to? And, virtuousness, and certainly here, I don't want this to be seen as virtuousness, right? What we're trying to do what is right. But I wouldn't say that, oh, I'm right, everybody else is wrong necessarily, and that I don't want anybody to debate with me and share their ideas with me, and that I have some sort of, special right over them because of the knowledge that I'm sharing and because of the information that we have. I wouldn't claim that, right? I'm still where everybody else is. I'm simply just sharing what I found and simply sharing my thoughts and experiences. So I know my boundaries. I know who I am. Know thyself, right? So I'm not going to become somebody or try to be somebody who I'm not. It's being secure.
A good self-measure for anybody. I know this is something that helped me a lot in my own psychological and emotional development, is to simply remind yourself that there's often two sides to every coin. But now you have to realize we live in a world of duality that really offers two main sides. The next level of intelligence develops when you realize that those two sides also have two sides of their side, right? So you go a little bit deeper in understanding that if you're being, if you are the victim in a particular situation, you could handle that in two ways. You could want to fight to get out of it, but you're stuck. But you could also learn, because it might be easier to capitalize off of your victimhood mentality now, because that's, there's political ideologies around claiming everybody's a victim, and that you somehow in your mind think, well, it's easier actually than to empower myself and to take self-responsibility. It's easier for me to capitalize and get my needs met by proselytizing my victimhood consciousness. So you have to just be able to kind of realize there's two sides to every story, and then take that a bit deeper and say, where do I lie? And then let me see the two sides of the story here, the positive and negative. Yeah, it's complicated.
Even when people just share their stories, they go into, oh, this happened to me, this happened to me, trying to gain someone's sympathy. And you'll see in political rallies all this rah, rah, rah of like, oh, we're strong, we got this, we have this. And that's like where the virtuousness comes in. It's like, this other side is bad, we have all the answers, we know we are correct, right? And so it's hardening that ideology. It's making it more ingrained.
Yeah. The Eastern methodologies of really working to attain self-knowledge and balance, I think really, really could be utilized at this point. So understand where you've come from, be realistic about where you've come from, and then don't deny help, but don't rely on help. You have to, in every situation, really understand, how can I work towards a healthy balance here?
So of the dark triad of personalities, we have narcissism, which we talked about Larkin Rose before. He's a screenwriter. There's a great movie called The Jones Plantation, which he created. And it details a lot of psychology the deeper you go into it. He talks about this idea of toxic narcissism in particular in one of his presentations called The Nature of the Beast, where he talks about politics and those individuals that are within the entire system and all their mentalities. So he details that narcissists, both individuals and governments, manipulate and deceive to gain power and control. Their actions and words are often an act to exploit and dominate others. Narcissists thrive on fear, division, and the subservience of others. Understanding the tactics of narcissists can help empower individuals and disempower tyrants. Unity and cooperation between people is essential to break the divide and conquer strategy of narcissists. So he's saying here that the narcissists want people divided, want people disempowered, want people in fear, division, subservience. And he says that gaslighting and projection are common tactics used by narcissists to confuse and control their victims. Narcissists target empathetic and caring individuals, exploiting their goodness for their own gain. And you can just think about all those times in politics where they use emotional arguments to captivate people, not just because they're more effective than intellectual arguments, but because they want people's trust. And many people are very trusting of others they perceive to be like them, or trusting in general, like, oh, I trust this person because, he's saying all the right things. And, what else am I going to do? I mean, I just have to vote, right? They say they're just part of the system. That's just how the system operates. So they work within the confines of that system, and they say, well, there has to be some good somewhere within it because we have it for good. This is necessary. So they make that justification for themselves to allow them to trust, and then they put that trust in somebody who may be exploiting it, and they may not recognize it because these dark personalities are all based on deceit, all based on some level of manipulation.
Sam Vaknin says that in order for a narcissist to get into a relationship with anybody, and this is, you can look at this personally, or you can look at this collectively and system-based, is that they require the 4 S's, which is safety, supply, service, and sex. And if you're providing 2 out of 4 of those on a consecutive basis, the narcissist will remain in a good, healthy standing with you. So it's just important to know, especially as people who are good-hearted and empathetic, the narcissist is aware of your good-heartedness because they can see that you're going to provide 2 of those 4 S's, if not more, for them to keep the relationship going, because you tend to be an overgiver, which really is about needing your own healing, and projecting it out to help someone else. So,
wow.
I think this last sentence is really important for all like helping professionals to think about. Narcissists target empathetic and caring individuals, exploiting their goodness for their own gain. I think that the helping fields of social work, counseling, teaching, nursing, are filled with people with good intentions who are caring and empathetic. And that is a driving motivation for many people in these fields. And yet I'm also seeing very clearly that this exploitation is very present, but not seen generally by people doing the work.
Wow. Yeah. He expands on this. He says, recognizing the parallels between narcissistic individuals and ruling regimes helps to understand the motives and methods behind their actions and how they gain or maintain power. Giving narcissistic individuals or governments another chance only empowers them further and perpetuates the cycle of abuse. Empowering individuals with knowledge about narcissism can help protect against manipulation and control. Embracing diversity and respecting different perspectives can prevent narcissists from exploiting divisions and fostering fear. So there he's giving us the solution from what we could say a psychological point of view is like, let's empower the individual. So again, those external factors will not really come into conflict because this person has control over their own mind, over their own body. So nothing can really manipulate them. There's a lot of things we can say can manipulate people, right? We identified money, we identified drugs, politics, whatever it is. Anything could manipulate someone if they are disempowered and don't feel like they own themselves or to some degree see their own value, right?
Corey, I'd like to add something, a nuance that's important about that duality of duality is that
Sure.
it's critical to empower individuals about narcissism, but remember, we live in a culture that wants to perpetuate our brokenness. So I see amongst the world of social media this proclivity towards groups of empaths unite. I'm an empath. I'm a sensitive soul. Again, they want to perpetuate this narrative, not really understanding that that is not necessarily the ideal label that you want to, apply to yourself, that actually you want to empower your empathy and you want to strengthen within that framework so you can defend yourself and exhibit appropriate self-defense within the world. So again, remember, the easier thing to do is to say, where can I find people who are like me and we're victims and we're sensitive and have to hide from the world and we always attract the bad guys and you guys all get me. It's actually to go against that comfort a little bit and say, how can I actually create self-defense? I am sensitive. I'm a loving, empathic individual. How can I empower myself? So you don't have to polarize and become the toxic person, but you do need to be aware of what your proclivity is and empower yourself for that balance, for proper self-defense.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Is that even when we talk about like those feelings we get as the result of the oppression, we don't want to identify with that. Yeah, I see what you're saying, and there's movements, there's ideologies for everything, in our world if we want to be a part of that. But that's not necessarily truly healing, right? Being a part of an identity and just falling to another group, leaving another group for another. I mean, we're just continuing the cycle where we're still not in control of ourselves, but it doesn't have any label, like we mentioned before.
Yeah, yeah. Does this limit my identity and role? Does it constrict me into being stuck in this role? Or do I have to lean into the discomfort a little bit? That's the thing. We need to, instead of just falling victim to what we think we are, we always have to lean in a little bit to that discomfort to find a little more balance without polarizing and then becoming more aggressive and dominating. And now I'm an empowered boss bitch and nobody's going to take advantage of me. You've gone too far. You've gone too far.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe admit to some of our confusion too. Admit to some of the facts that we don't know, but not that we feel powerless, right? Just because we don't know. And there's that idea of the ego death, right? Which is that we don't have that ego over us. So we're just like, okay. Jim Carrey, a famous actor, went through that. I don't know if you know about his story, but he went through Hollywood. He got to all this success, became this big celebrity everybody knew, and he realized, I'm not Jim Carrey. That was just somebody I was trying to live. It's like, but I'm much more than that. And it was quite an interesting breakthrough that he went through personally as somebody who got everything handed to him, right? Realizing that's not true fulfillment.
Brave to have a public ego degradation.
Yeah, Hollywood's worst nightmare because it's
And
literally
the medical fields.
It's actually a video titled "Hollywood's Worst Nightmare" with Jim Carrey. It goes into the subject if you're interested. But when we talk about narcissism, let's bring in some of these other ones here. We have psychopathy, and from an individual whose name I cannot pronounce. If one of you guys can pronounce it, that would be great. But he's a psychiatrist, and he talks about something called political Ponerology. All right. And so Ponerology is the study of evil. He says, quote, in the psychopath, a dream emerges like some utopia of a happy world in a social system which does not reject them or force them to submit to laws and customs whose meaning is incomprehensible to them. They dream of a world in which their simple and radical way of experiencing and perceiving reality would dominate, where they would, of course, be assured safety and prosperity. In this utopian dream, they imagine that those others, different, but also more technically skillful than they are, should be put to work to achieve this goal for the psychopaths and others of their kin. We, they say, after all, will create a new government, one of justice. They are prepared to fight and to suffer for the sake of such a brave new world, and also, of course, to inflict suffering upon others. Such a vision justifies killing people whose suffering does not move them to compassion because they are not quite conspecific. They do not realize that they will consequently meet with opposition which can last for generations. Subordinating a normal person to psychologically abnormal individuals has severe and deforming effects on his or her personality. It engenders trauma and neurosis. Now, this is quite a powerful quote that we're going to be breaking down quite a bit, because sometimes, we come across this and I would look at this and I'm like, gosh, I don't know where to start. I don't even know how to understand some of this, right? But this idea of neurosis is something you might see common in trauma as we move on, as two particular aspects that we got to look at here when it comes to medicine and psychology. Notice the language here as them and we and us and others, and they're different. And the way we perceive this reality and perceive others. This is all about perception, considering the fact we perceive certain people to have the right to do violence, or that we have the right to do it under this circumstance or that circumstance, making all sorts of justifications.
I think it's super powerful that just accepting, I think what it's implying is that just by accepting that we're subordinate to another who is claiming an authority or a higher degree of importance, right? Just by accepting that, we are inherently being or experiencing trauma. And that by experiencing trauma, there are effects that he's calling neuroses.
And this also helps to explain, we were looking at group involvement in evil or permitting evil. How few people it takes, and Ponerology, this book here, really expands on this, how few people it actually takes to radiate out from the true psychopath, because they're around 1% or around that area. Okay, it's not everybody. And yet we live in a world that sometimes we feel like it's filled with psychopaths. The fact is that these people have a lot of influence. They dominate by fear and terror, and not always open terror. It's not open threats. And because of their influence, we get the impression that it's all around us. And it tends to give the feeling of a dangerous environment. And it's one of the reasons that we cling to authority is because it's hard to let go of the fear, thinking the world is like this all over the place. And being unable to identify and isolate this character has plagued mankind for centuries. And now we finally have the information, but we have some bad habits, some preconceptions that we still haven't gotten rid of. And we have to educate ourselves. And this is a great book. This is one of the highest level books I've ever read. So it's maybe not the starting point, but to learn about the narcissist, to learn about the sociopath and the psychopath, and what are the differences and how do they operate. They're 1 or 2 or 3% of the population, and yet they reign over the rest of us through deception, through a long entrenched system of domination by terror.
Mm.
I just wanted to add, Scott, is that this psychopath in power and the influence that they have amongst their environment, and how sometimes that can cultivate and create a secondhand psychopathy. And sometimes these behaviors of narcissism as well, they're not necessarily just overt. We're coming to find now that some of the most dangerous people that we have in society are really secondhand psychopaths or covert narcissists, those who operate amongst that field of projecting niceness into the world.
Yes.
But really deeply beneath that is this very psychological way of manipulating the public and those around them. And when somebody's in a leadership position, those right underneath you, second below you, third tier below you, are looking up to you. And that you get influenced in that environment. So it's often can be unseen, as you said, and it's very tricky to discern in these environments that could the person you're looking up to, that's top in your field that you've dedicated your life to, be a psychopath unknowingly?
That's a great point, and that's something I meant to expand on, and I'm glad you caught that, is that, yeah, they're 1 or 2 or 3%, but their influence temporarily, people working around them can start to take on those traits. And until they're disconnected from that person, for a long period of time, they may behave like the psychopath, like the narcissist. And so this is another reason it's not just an illusion, but this is another reason that we see those types of behaviors more than 1 or 2 or 3%, go up to 20 or 30%.
I've actually seen through Sam Vaknin's work, he has described political articles that actually have openly claimed you should raise your child as a narcissist because they will be more successful in society.
Man. Yeah, that is something to be aware of here, is connecting the dots. Like, for instance, here talking about Ponerology, he does not talk about statism explicitly in the book. But if we connect this with what Larkin Rose has said about toxic narcissism, we can see a great connection here where, yeah, there are psychopaths, but then there's those people who enforce the psychopaths, who allow the psychopaths to do the actions that they do. And that is a whole different realm of study, because some people only look at the controllers, at the people who are in that mindset, but they don't look at the environment that perpetrates that allows it, that conditions it, that actually can maybe make more of it, right? And so what about this? This is all psychopathology in politics. He shares with us infiltration. Psychopaths often manipulate their way into positions of power within political systems. They may appear charismatic, but their lack of empathy and conscience allows them to exploit others. Gradual influence over time, psychopathic traits influence decision-making, policy, and governance. Their psychological behavior becomes normalized, affecting the entire system. Well, if it's becoming normalized, what does that mean, right? It means that the psychopathy is being, as Stephanie suggested, being spread. I mean, in a second-hand psychopathic way. And so it's very interesting to observe, because we might have those behaviors and traits within ourselves and not see it.
When we prioritize the material over the spiritual and the holistic, the psychopath, the leader, the political, whoever it is, there's a lot of material success that tends to come with somebody who is in a high state of power. So it's power, it's money, it's cars, it's influence. And again, unfortunately, a lot of society thinks that that's what they want because they're not fully, truly, spiritually, emotionally, holistically informed. So they look up to the narcissists and to the psychopaths because they think that material success is going to allot them what they want and to get the happiness that they desire in life, which at the end of the day, money can help in our survival. That's a part of our society. But at the end of the day, that material-based reductionist way of looking at your life is going to leave you hollow and your soul be devoid of true connection. So
yeah, you're definitely foreshadowing a lot of the things we're going to be talking about with that too. We're not done talking about money. Of course, like I said, it is affecting a lot of people. But let's look at the founders and supporters of oppressive regimes, not just one or the other. The psychopathic leaders, these individuals rise to power by exploiting fear, propaganda, manipulation. So again, you're going to see some repeats here among the researchers, among the people mentioning, what is narcissism, what is psychopathy, suppressing dissent. This goes in line with what Mercola said about censorship that we talked about in the beginning, right? They suppress dissent, control information, eliminate opposition. Fear and loyalty keep supporters in line. Okay, so it's either you're in fear and you're disobeying, or you're loyal and you're nice and protected and secure and you feel at peace. But is that really peace? I mean, there's that common quote by Benjamin Franklin. I think it basically says peaceful slavery or dangerous freedom, right? And he says he prefers dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery. And it's very interesting when you put it like that. Is it really dangerous if he prefers it? Why does he prefer it? And why is he calling it dangerous? It's a quote that stands to represent this sort of nuance in psychology that we're detailing. And co-opting ideological movements. We talked about gaslighting. We talked about the Hegelian dialectic. Here you see it again. Manipulating narratives. They twist ideological movements to serve their interests. They hijack slogans, symbols, and rhetoric. And they subvert principles. Okay, genuine causes are co-opted for personal gain. Psychopaths use ideological cover to consolidate power and suppress dissent. Right? What can seem like an empowering cause for an individual might not be. And some people have talked about the New Age, right? The New Age spirituality as being perhaps outside of religion, outside the constraints of the institution. But what has New Age become? Maybe in its own regard, still suppressing the individual from looking into themselves. They're still looking up to some guru, still looking up to some spiritual doctrine, some ideology. And, is it really actually going to help them? Is it really going to heal them? Oh, they go from this drug to another drug, this drug maybe even to a natural medicinal. Are they still, even then, addressing the health that they need for themselves?
Empowerment comes from within.
Well, there is a fluctuation of society, and this is important to mention because some folks who listen to this and understand these concepts will say, well, isn't it inevitable? Isn't this just history on repeat? Aren't we just actually following, perhaps, maybe we are following the path of Nazi Germany or some of these really tyrannical regimes? What if we are in the wrong direction? Well, if that's the case, can we actually prevent it? Maybe we can look at the cycles of history and study how these types of things manifest. So according to Labasuski, I'm just going to say that as his name for political ponerology, he says all societies fluctuate between happy times and unhappy times. During happy times, the privileged classes enjoy prosperity and suppress advanced psychological knowledge of psychopathological influence in the corridors of power. Though happy, these times are not necessarily morally advanced, as the privileged classes' prosperity or happiness may be premised on the oppression or exploitation of others. To block out such inconvenient truths, the voice of conscience, the privileged, they use conversive thinking, which means changing the outcome of the reasoning process to a more convenient outcome. This is accompanied by a rise in egotism and emotionalism. This growing hysteria of the privileged classes, the emotionalism, egotism, and conversive thinking, spreads across society over several generations. National hysteria is a natural cycle and forms a sine wave almost 200 years long. Hysteria causes people to lose the ability to differentiate between psychologically healthy and pathological individuals. So that is very intriguing, talking about this cycle of history. And he's talking about egotism and emotionalism. Maybe, again, we can relate this to the left brain and the right brain as well.
Is there an example in history that comes to mind that would demonstrate this? That you have?
We talked about before, right, Nazi Germany, which I think is usually used as a common example when we're talking about psychopaths, when we're talking about domination and power. And you notice there's a lot of hysteria, fear around certain groups of people and having to expel them or bring them to certain countries, or even during times of war, there's a lot of fear about this country's invading this place, this ideology is taking over. And so I think that's a good example, perhaps, of a mass hysteria, which is something that's also called mass psychosis that we identify throughout this work. And you'll see this also as a common theme. So it's just interesting, however, to see how this spreads over society, he says, over several generations, and how it's almost about 200 years long. So perhaps we don't have track of it. You know, we lose track of it. We don't really know what's going on. I mean, because it's such a long span of time of just gradual changes in people's mentality that people may not even see their own exploitation. Right? This gets us thinking.
This is why consciousness is a threat to society. And really, the war is the war on consciousness, because then we awaken to the patterns and we start to hopefully find the courage to rise against this dysfunction.
Yeah. Well, he talks about how this is like the beginning of pathocracy. Okay, so let us continue here so we can get more context. He says, in this environment, the behavior of characteropaths, or individuals with slight brain tissue damage from toxic substances, viruses, difficult births, or pathological parenting, is accepted as normal, and this acts as a gateway to normalizing the behavior of those with genetic deviations, including psychopathy. Finally, near the point of maximum hysteria, society becomes polarized. We talked about group polarization, and paralyzed, and the most psychologically egotistical of all spellbinders can come to power. The spellbinder worsens the psychological health of those under his or her influence. This may be the beginning of what he calls a pathocracy, though he says not inevitable. So he's saying this cycle, like Stephanie's saying, is not inevitable. There can be a shift in consciousness that can happen, but this pathocracy is in which individuals with biologically based psychopathology, including personality disorders, especially psychopathy, occupy positions of power and influence. The spellbinder hides behind an ideological mask, a belief system that he uses to gain power. Any belief system can be used as an ideological mask, including religion. Isn't that interesting? Any belief system. So it makes you question all the motives, all the many attempts throughout history to gain power for righteous or unrighteous or whatever, because people have different views of what is right and wrong in many cases, and what should be imposed on everybody else. Maybe that's part of the problem. You have this ideology used to draw people in, to tell other people, no, you can't be a part of this, right? Or this is something that everybody needs to do. And if you don't like it, this is what's going to happen to you. To get to that point of, we are right, you are wrong, they have to convince people. They have to be on their side. They have to work from the current ideologies and build in their ideology into it. Right? This is that subversive co-opting that we talked about before. So this is that whole path of pathocracy that we're detailing here. And so trusting psychopaths in power, There's a lot of trust. We mentioned that good people are gullible. They fall to the psychopaths. Psychopaths have no problems with wearing personal masks or ideological masks and are accepted as normal within the spellbinders movement. A network of psychopaths gradually begins to dominate, and they begin to eliminate the brain tissue damaged in those who generally believe in the ideology. At a certain point, the minority block of psychopaths has a showdown with all those they've usurped. A full-blown pathocracy is known as a totalitarian state. And again, we use Nazi Germany as an example, and it's characterized by a government turned against its own people. A pathocracy may emerge when a society is insufficiently guarded against a typical and inevitable minority of such abnormal pathology, which he asserts is caused by biology or genetics. He argues that in such cases, these individuals infiltrate an institution or state, prevailing moral values are perverted into their opposite, and a coded language like Orwell's doublethink circulates into the mainstream, using paralogic and paramoralism in place of genuine logic and morality. There are various identifiable stages of pathocracy described by him, but ultimately pathocracy dies because the pathological and are promoted to positions of power, even though they have little or no talent or abilities. So they cannot sustain, right? It's like an illusion that they're casting upon others, a projection, and eventually it does fade away, although perhaps at the expense of many people in their lives. Again, democide, the top cause of death that we're detailing here. This is the manifestation from literally from point A to point B, how it goes from like this one person who has good intentions running for the people, by the people, to tyranny. Oh my, where are we? Now the government's against us, and it all crashes and comes back again as this sort of cycle, which you can also look up the Tytler cycle, who is a judge and historian, and you can see how it goes from bondage back to faith, then courage, liberty, abundance, and then selfishness seems to be this dividing line. Once people say this is about me and I'm entitled, I have perhaps the right to rule, I have this special right given to me. Maybe they say God gave it to them, or that through some piece of paper it specially declared them to be so. People, and they start convincing other people to do so, there becomes complacency, apathy, dependence, and then bondage, and then it continues. The cycle just keeps going on because people still believe in that entitlement, in that special position. So, Tytler, again, these individuals did not know about statism. They did not talk about that. From my understanding, that's where statism fits into this chart, where selfishness is the dividing line. What do you guys think?
I'll just say that I think this is a real bird's eye view, to grasp and contemplate this. It's really powerful, but it will involve like pulling your viewpoint back and looking at large swaths of history. These are people that have studied history over hundreds and hundreds of years probably, and looked at these big, wide cycles of repetition.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't mean that we can't like step out of it, and change course.
And that's why they do this, right? Is to identify patterns, like Stephanie said, to see with our consciousness, maybe things can change because there isn't really a cycle. We have new things in existence, like technology, which we've never had before. So there are new things being created, despite some things we may say are cycles. So it's very interesting to observe, and I open, the conversation to you, the viewer. I wanted to go briefly over the history. I know that we're talking mostly about psychology, but once in a while we're going to talk about economics and then talk about history. And if this doesn't interest you, so be it. But I think it's important just to have that context and to see what is out there, because it certainly ties into our psychology, looking at why people have faith, what prompts them to have faith, right? In this case, or use religion as a way of like, oh my gosh, end times are coming. Oh my gosh, we need to be saved. And the systems are falling apart. And so I need to look up to God, right? Why? And it tells us when we look throughout history, maybe some of the psychological cues that are happening. Similarly, another individual who studied history quite a bit was Arnold Toynbee. And so he identified certain stages that civilizations go through. The first stage is called a genesis, the birth phase of a civilization. It's often triggered by a creative response to a significant challenge. A small group of innovative leaders or a creative minority emerges, setting the foundation for the new civilization. This period is marked by the establishment of a new social, political, and cultural structure, right? And again, statism, is it here? Is it not? Well, here are just a bunch of people coming up with creative solutions. They never said they had the authority or right to rule over another, right? That point is at question. Are these creative minorities claiming that they're special, more special than everyone else? Like, that's where I think we're trying to head at. It's like, are they? Well, there's a growth to this genesis. The civilization expands and flourishes. The creative minority continues to effectively address challenges, leading to advancements in technology, culture, and governance. This period is characterized by increasing complexity and integration within society, as well as territorial expansion and economic growth. Territorial, right? Well, if that's the case, then they're claiming certain things to be theirs. Start to perhaps delve into selfishness, delve into, oh, this is ours because we created it, right? And therefore, we have the right to it, perhaps. And so then we start to see some times of trouble because a period of internal and external stress takes place. The civilization faces significant challenges such as political instability, economic decline, social unrest, or external threats. The ability of the civilization to navigate these troubles depends on the resilience and adaptability of its institutions and leaders. Is our system very adaptive? We have a lot of systems and drugs and laws that are made all the time. And some of them are as a response to others that have not worked good. And others are there and they may be temporary because they're made by man and they're not really lasting. They're not preventative. So something to bear in mind also is that recessions can also be called depressions. And I think that could be significant because we talk about this idea of the Great Depression, and many people warn about economic collapses throughout history. Well, it's interesting when we look at the mental health of people during those times. We see spikes of depression during economic depressions, during a world of instability. So perhaps, reflective on the mass scale of things, our society, we start seeing trickling down to the individual a depression on all scales. And so what happens then is a universal state. If the civilization successfully overcomes the times of trouble, it may enter the universal state phase. This is a period of relative stability and dominance where a centralized political and cultural order is established. The civilization exerts significant influence over a large area, often through a powerful empire or state. However, this phase can also lead to complacency and stagnation. And then from there, a disintegration. In the final stage, the civilization begins to decline and eventually collapses. This disintegration occurs when the creative minority fails to respond effectively to new challenges, leading to a loss of cohesion and vitality. The civilization may fragment into smaller entities and its cultural and political influence diminishes. This stage can be marked by invasions, internal decay, and the rise of new civilizations. All right, so if you want, pause and you could kind of take in sort of the historical background here as to how these systems are created and how they persist and then fall and then new ones get created. So back to what we're talking about with the psychology then, let's talk about The Power Elite. This is actually a book by C. Wright Mills, a sociologist. He says the kind of moral and psychological beings men become is in large part determined by the values they experience and the institutional roles they are allowed and expected to play. So throughout history, we see that, there's certain cultures, there's certain lines of thinking. If you don't fit in with this culture, it's going to be hard for you to to basically live there. And all those pressures are kept in place, which keeps things going in a certain direction. But maybe that direction could be challenged, and that cycle does not need to exist when people start questioning that on a mass scale, right? You see a whole shift in consciousness. And so he says if the prestige of elite circles contains a large element of moral reputation, they can keep it, even if they lose considerable power. If they have prestige, but with but little reputation, their prestige can be destroyed by even a temporary and relative decline of power. So reputation, he's saying, is more than anything. The way people perceive those that they consider to be authority figures is more important than actually what's happening, because that's going to determine everything else. He says prestige buttresses power, turning it into authority and protecting it from social challenge. Prestige lost by want of success, Laban has remarked, disappears in a brief space of time. It can also be worn away, but more slowly, by being subjected to discussion. From the moment prestige is called into question, it ceases to be prestige. The gods and men who have kept their prestige for long have never tolerated discussion. For the crowd to admire, it must be kept at a distance. Power for power's sake is psychologically based on prestige gratification. And I love this because it kind of gets more specific as to what we mean by authority, right? It's saying, okay, this is what happens when you mix prestige and power. It turns into authority. And that is where, there's no question of that authority. You don't want to question it, because the minute you question it, it's out of the picture. Like, yeah, this person who's wearing this fancy crown and uniform, no, he's just a person. Once we start questioning that, it's like, yeah, it's pretty evident. But if we don't question it, we say, okay, yeah, he has the right to rule over us, but he's just like an everyday individual, just a person among us who's sharing his own perspective on the world. He's not really good or bad, he's just him, but we look up to him as if he's something more.
I want to pause and share a bit about people in these positions of prestige, which would be, a therapist, a doctor, someone who is seen as an expert, or, people turn to you for answers, often when they're very vulnerable. And, ask yourself, if you are in one of those positions, how defensive are you when your word, your advice is refused? Are you open to having your prestige challenged? Because if you're not, then there's a block there that's really interfering with the therapeutic process and with the healing process.
So then he continues to say, in addition to their enlarged and centralized means of administration, exploitation, and violence, the modern elite have had placed within their grasp historically unique instruments of psychic management and manipulation, which includes universal compulsory education, as well as the media of mass communication. So he's saying two of the most powerful things they can use, education system and the media. Which is why, we are creating this. This is a form of media. This is a form of education. If we're going to kind of combat that type of system that we feel like we might be stuck in, a system that isn't working, we have to show by example a better system in its place. And so we're creating media that is in opposition as an alternative to the current. We'll delve deeper into that as well, as we also mentioned before, David Rodriguez and breaking down the school system. But there is a book called The Machiavellians, and Machiavellianism in psychology is slightly different from this concept of the Machiavellians, but it's nonetheless the same relative thing, named after Niccolo Machiavelli, and a book, James Burnham. So he says, quote, criticism of the group is personal libel against the leader. Criticism of the leader is subversion and treason against the group. So the group is seen as one with the leader. The despotism of the leaders, moreover, does not arise solely from a vulgar lust of power or from uncontrolled egoism, but is often the outcome of a profound and sincere conviction of their own value and of the services which they have rendered to the common cause. It's for the greater good. It's for everybody, right? And so this is similar to what Carl Jung talks about regarding autocracy and individuality. And we have a lot of quotes from Carl Jung as we move on. So definitely stay with us here as we detail this idea of the group, the doublethink, and how we escape that group dynamic to respect the individual and realize that we are not part of that group, not part of that identity or that title. So more pertinent to this understanding of statism is perhaps the authoritarian personality. developed by Theodore Adorno, an author and social theorist, who says a basically hierarchical, authoritarian, exploitive parent-child relationship is apt to carry over into a power-oriented, exploitatively dependent attitude toward one's sex partner and one's God, and may well culminate in a political philosophy and social outlook, which has no room for anything but a desperate clinging to what appears to be strong and a disdainful rejection of whatever is relegated to the bottom. It's very interesting. A note on this that I notice, some folks who study the left brain and the right brain, and Stephanie, maybe you can clarify on this, will say that we live in a left brain dominant world. Could you clarify for us what that means, maybe in relationship to this?
Sure. I'm not an expert by any means, but what I will say is that due to tech, industrialization, we've been driven into more of an analytical, logical mindset, an objective mindset, which is really important. But when there's an imbalance between the subjective and the objective, or the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere, or just the simple energetic principles of the relationship between the logical, analytical, linear with the creative, nonlinear, care, and empathetic sides of ourselves, we can become radically imbalanced. And that's what we're seeing more than ever, especially with the rise of technocracy, is that we're becoming more and more disconnected from what we can actually call the soul of human existence, which is truly in the relationship of these two energies.
Do you think it has to do with what he mentions here, a clinging to what appears to be strong, a clinging to like a protector or to that authoritarian figure?
I think one of you guys probably could elaborate on this, but I would just throw in that due to the lack of basic psychological understandings and concepts like integration of our childhood situations and integration of what we experienced with our primary providers and caregivers, is that if that does not come to conscious and become realized, the tendency is to just continue out those same dynamics and that same hierarchy in relationship of needing somebody to care for you, such as your partner, the state, or a system.
Or external rules, as opposed to thinking for oneself, becoming dependent on a rule book, a policy manual, following orders, as opposed to, thinking through logically and trusting one's conclusions.
Yeah. I think kind of like what we mentioned before with the external locus of control, there might be what we see as a trend here among these researchers is projection, one degree or another. So getting more specific, like what is that projection? Why are they projecting? Can help us understand more of this personality and how that develops through someone's childhood into their later adulthood. And here we have a quote: conventionality, rigidity, repressive denial, and the ensuing breakthrough of one's weakness, fear, and dependency are but other aspects of the same fundamental personality pattern, and they can be observed in personal life as well as in attitudes toward religion and social issues. So as providers, we might just look at the personal life, may not necessarily look at the systems that influence that personal life.
If I could just quickly add, I think this feels like it's the call, the clarion call of our time historically, is to begin to what Carl Jung calls individuate, bring awareness to your patterns. Truly, I believe that almost all of us are projecting. And it's not that we live in a world where people are projecting and people aren't projecting. I believe the call is to become aware of your projections. At least you need to just start to become aware of your projections, to start to rescind them and make better conscious choices.
Mm-hmm. And here he goes on further, people too often cannot see the workings of society or their own role within it. And it is due not only to a social control that does not tell the truth, but to a blindness that is rooted in their own psychology. Although it cannot be claimed that psychological insight is any guarantee of insight into society, there is ample evidence that people who have the greatest difficulty in facing themselves are the least able to see the way the world is made. Resistance to self-insight and resistance to social facts are contrived, most essentially of the same stuff. It is here that psychology may play its most important role. Techniques for overcoming resistance, developed mainly in the field of individual psychotherapy, can be improved and adapted for use with groups and even for use on a mass scale. So he's telling us we can kind of heal the world in a sense here, not just the individuals that comprise of that world. And this blindness he's referring to, I think is a very interesting idea, since we're talking about a superstition or something that people long hold that they don't see within themselves. So there's going to be resistance, right? There's going to be the need for self-insight, self-actualization. We talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and self-realization and going into ourselves. That could be quite difficult, right? I'm pretty sure Carl Jung even said that's like one of the most difficult things is simplicity. Just trying to be present, just trying to reflect and do that shadow work.
And in working with someone one-on-one, it's a lot easier to get them to look at beliefs and ideas that might be detrimental, might be stuck in the subconscious. But what I've observed myself is that people who are really good at making videos that portray reality pretty well or establish the problem so that a solution can be seen are also extremely valuable. They are actually the mass psychologists, those who can produce video and mass consumption that allow us to reflect upon ourselves in a group setting, more or less a group setting. You can watch a video separately or you can watch it, but it does reach lots and lots of people, whereas one-on-one psychotherapy is limited in that regard.
Sure. And perhaps that's why there's a lot of big content creators and YouTubers now who, are doctors, right? Who are physicians, and they're sharing their message online and they're gaining tons of traction, or even just everyday individuals who start up channels on spirituality or therapy and different or psychology, and they're just sharing those ideas and people are just attracted to it or they're getting help from it. And there's people who are now just, going online for those answers. And now even AI is providing those answers for people. So maybe people are not so much reliant on the physician anymore or even going to any physical place, but just going straight up to some content creator or online for help. Maybe because it's more relatable. Maybe because somebody can understand it better. They break it down for the individual. Maybe it's because it is somebody like them. It isn't somebody who, went through 8 years of schooling necessarily. I find that interesting.
Corey, if I could just quickly add, is that it's become very relevant. And as people begin to shed the layers of distortion from their own view and their eyes start to open up, we see the incredible amount of institutional gatekeeping. And people are now starting to be able to feel that. And when they get into these groups or spaces or communities of people who are just really radically honest and sharing and not gatekeeping at all, it's very attractive. And a lot can take place energetically in those spaces when we're not playing roles and there's not gatekeeping and there's not that hierarchical system where somebody has to be lower than. So I think this energy has opened up where humanity is starting to feel what is right as opposed to what is a created system of hierarchy.
Yeah. Well, he breaks down the traits for this authoritarian personality, as he calls it. And it's included not wanting individual thinking, so, don't wanting people to think for themselves, aggression against them, stereotyping, superstitions. We're talking about the most dangerous superstition, and then projection, which we noticed as a common theme here, just like people's having internal problems, not addressing that internal, and then wanting something external to them. So Adorno came to the conclusion that people with authoritarian personalities showed a greater inclination for putting people into the categories of us or them. They obviously considered the us group superior. And then all personalities observed were highly influenced by childhood experiences.
Yeah.
So what goes on in their childhood, right? We talked about schooling a little bit.
I would just like to add again quickly, I have a friend who is a pioneering in the medical field. And a very interesting thing that he had said to me one time that has stuck with me completely is that he said to me, insofar as the medical institution, what they're providing for the general public and public health, he said, you don't understand. We're just giving you, the patient's humanity, what you ask for. So I've thought about this deeply, and there's this dysfunctional blind spot in the relationship where it's like the chicken or the egg. Are you giving them what you feel like they can't do for themselves and they're asking for that? Or is that actually all you're giving them and they don't have any other choice and they're falling victim to that same brainwashing? Like, which one of these is actually coming first?
Yeah.
In our childhood experiences, we'll create a template for relationships, especially related to hierarchy and authority-based relationships. And so when we are well trained to be more submissive or subservient to an authority figure, then that will certainly play out in our adult lives when the institutions that we're interacting with are using that same model, that same template.
Yeah. And this is where basic psychology could be so incredibly valuable. I know that everyone here has this same belief, is that if you are aware of your childhood dynamics, number one, most people aren't even aware really of how their childhood dynamics affect their day-to-day life as an adult. If you are aware of that, and then are you the type of person who goes, which spectrum do you go on? What side do you go on after that? Do you stay the subservient and play that in your life? Or do you polarize into the rebel and then defy authority? So just some basic information of where have you come from? And then how are you reacting based off where you come from? Where do you lie on that spectrum? And what can we provide you to help counterbalance that behavior to find more of an equilibrium, or a way at least to self-regulate when you notice that you're going too far in one of those directions?
What comes to mind here for me is flexibility. And children are usually very malleable, very open to information. So that could be used against them in the sense of getting them into a certain worldview or ideology and getting them stuck somewhere. But in their flexibility in maintaining that into adulthood, being able to discern through information and then learning how to think would be a very nice flexibility where you're not projecting, you're not falling to superstition, you're not saying us versus them, and developing sort of these identities. I just notice, what comes to mind here is that flexibility that perhaps is missing here, because authoritarian is, I want things this way and I can't have things this way, right? So it's like, well, why do people like that way? Why do people disagree with you? Can you understand that? And I think sometimes it's difficult to see that if you're tunnel visioned into one way of thinking, perhaps your whole life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, real quick, I just also would like to just add in is I think we fail to realize in our attempts for unity and understanding and wanting to be together as humanity, we fail to realize that actually we've experienced different things here on Earth, and that we've repaired differently, and that we've overcome differently. And some people actually are at different stages of development. And that's very critical for us to accept. If we can accept that we do have different stages of development, very similar to Ken Wilber's integral theory, is that we have different stages of development, and how, as we develop, can we still find compassion for those who've come where we've been, and also realizing that those who have not broken through those layers to some of the higher levels of awareness, they can't see. They're blind yet to some of those realizations because they haven't yet experienced it at all. So I think if we just brought more awareness and had different ways, like Corey, you were saying, of just bringing the information to people, at least there's something we can tangibly look at. And then the key would be for humanity to not judge as we all evolve together, but slightly differently.
What do you mean by not judge in particular?
I see Scott and I had talked about this, and I think Scott was the one who came up with the term scorpion effect, right?
Okay.
So what I mean is it seems to me that once you've come to a self-actualization about a way in which you needed to evolve and improve, you may have been struggling with something, you take years to work on it, and then you pop your bubble and you're in a new state of being because you've integrated that particular version of you. Once a person gets close to the next level of breakthrough or breaks through, they tend to most critically harsh somebody or something that is merely just 2 steps behind you, because you've been able to break through into another space and realm and space of realization, that you have a disdain for that which were where you were, because often you feel like you were stuck there and you're working so hard to break through that version of yourself. So once you break through, I see often playing out, we can become very critical to that which we just were and get very snippy and start coming at people because literally we just broke through into a new reality. And that, that arrogance, hubris can really come out, and we start judging that which we just were. We can have more compassion for somebody who's been where we were a long time ago. Oh, I've been there. I understand. Oh, they must be really suffering. This capacity for compassion is greater than somebody who just broke through someplace where you were. And I think that needs to be where we need to hold the most compassion.
I would relate that to having compassion for oneself as well, because if you're at peace with your own journey, then you will not be as critical of your neighbors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you for expanding on that idea of projection here in individuals in relation to, their relationship to other people, how they view themselves and others, because we're going to see that as a common trait here. Putting ourselves in categories we talked about before, also diagnosing people and putting labels on them, right? So there's a lot of perception games being played here. To understand with statism, it's not so much a physical manifestation, that's like the end result, talking about democide and the effects, but understanding like what's happening in that mindset that leads up to that point. It starts all the way back in childhood. So, it's quite an interesting subject to get into, because
they say that, I was just going to say, they say that things in the mirror are closer than they appear. And if you have not yet fully integrated, like Leslie said, and found that compassion for yourself, you're not going to like what's right up in your face. So,
yeah. Well, here's a study of the popular mind, and this was done by Gustave Le Bon, an MD, polymath, and he says the most democratic country in the world lives nevertheless under a monarchical regime, whereas the countries in which the most oppressive despotism is rampant are the Spanish-American republics, in spite of their republican constitutions. The destinies of peoples are determined by their character and not by their government. I have endeavored to establish this view in my previous volume by setting forth categorical example. Now, of course, we're including this. This is interesting because now, when I just emphasized the mind just previously, before Stephanie spoke, I was referring to like this idea of like we have our actions, we have the effects that we're bringing out into the world as physical manifestation that we see. Perhaps it's democide where there's a lot of death and we want to prevent that. We have to go back to the mindset of the people and recognize where is that coming from? What can prompt people to create such mass casualty? And you can see among even within history, some of the regimes that were most tyrannical had constitutions, had different freedoms that they granted people. So what went wrong? What was happening? And here, you have someone saying, well, it's not the government, actually. It's really just the people and their character. And that determines their destiny. And there's actually a lot of relationships here between democracies and monarchies, although people like to separate these. You can even go back to their foundations, people like Aristotle and Plato, and they would disagree about, should this work or should it not? So it goes back quite some time. People, debating about different systems working over others, but there doesn't tend to be a focus on psychology. There isn't an understanding of the mind. in that necessarily. And I tend to see that outside of the political talk. I don't see politicians or governments really considering psychology and how people's minds work in the mass public.
I think this sentence that you highlighted in red is both the good news and the bad news. You know, the destinies of peoples are determined by their character and not by their government. And I think what that tells us is that we, as the people, do have the power to shift the tide of our kind of collective reality. If we mentally take on the mindset of the authoritarian system, then we are perpetuating that. If we can separate out and see that as an immoral structure, then we have the power to shift the tide for our collective experience into something that is much more beneficial to all.
Well said, Leslie.
Rather than looking at a regime, we look at the personality, right? The authoritarian personality, as we just discussed. That's an individual.
It could be a part of all of us. You know, we may have that part rigidified, you know, calcified in us that under stress or fear plays out and leads to our participation in that system. So the self-knowledge and the integration of our parts is really important.
Yep. The individual, the system, the provider. We talked about that triad. Well, here he expands, it is the need not of liberty, but of servitude that is always predominant in the souls of crowds. They are so bent on obedience that they instinctively submit to whoever declares himself their master. In the past, and in no very distant past, the action of governments and the influence of a few writers and a very small number of newspapers constituted the real reflectors of public opinion. Today, the writers have lost all influence and the newspapers only reflect opinion. As for statesmen, far from directing opinion, their only endeavor is to follow it. They have a dread of opinion, which amounts at times to terror and causes them to adopt an utterly unstable line of conduct. Now, again, we're going to be covering many different researchers coming at this from many different angles. And his work is particularly looking at crowds and the nature of what happens when you bring a lot of people together. So he's saying, well, there's this instinctiveness to submit to this person that they view them as a master, as an authority figure. Now, is he going deeper into, like, let's say, Stanley Milgram and saying, well, what about that idea of authority or master? Is it something that's instinctive? I mean, we saw with those experiments, there were people willing to disobey. So what causes them to disobey, right? What causes them to say no? And is it possible that more people can say no? Or is it just an instinctive, submission where many people are always going to submit to whoever they view as the authority or master of their own lives? Is this an inevitable doom that we're talking about, or is this something that is completely reversible? And so, we see a lot of the newspapers, the media, the state having an influence on each other, of course, medicine with that. These all go hand in hand, and you can't leave out one or the other. The media contributes a lot to people's public perception of health and what is healthy, what is considered, nutritious. But people don't necessarily have to rely on the media either, just as much as the governments for their own personal health.
We have to learn to tap into our conscience again. Our individual conscience with the God of our own understanding instead of jumping to the crowd, because most often the crowd is reacting and the culture is reacting based off of a hidden subliminal subconscious trauma reaction, an egregore, an energy between people that just builds and builds and builds and creates a life of its own. So really returning to individual conscious as well.
Yeah. And why does the statement have a dread of opinion, a dread of perhaps that individual expressing their own thoughts? I think that's an interesting thing he's mentioning here. Not wanting perhaps people to think for themselves and become their own master, their own statesman, perhaps. He says the individual is bound to seek outside himself the forces he no longer finds within him. So going back to projection, he says the functions of governments necessarily increase in proportion as the indifference and helplessness of the citizens grow. They it is who must necessarily exhibit the initiative, enterprising, and guiding spirit in which private persons are lacking. It falls on them, talked about us versus them, we mentioned this before, to undertake everything, direct everything, and to take everything under their protection. The state becomes an all-powerful God. Still, experience shows that the power of such gods was never either very durable or very strong. And of course, we may add to that, very legitimate, right? Like, is it people look at power in terms of strength, in terms of who has the most ammunition or who has land or whatever. But what about that very identity that they're beholding to themselves, to that they're presuming due to their crown, to their position, to what they write on the piece of paper? And are people treating the state as a god? Well, we'll be surprised here to see that there's a lot of psychologists and researchers who are making this connection. And this might be powerful for medicine too, considering the fact religion has strong correlations to the state and its foundation, going back in history, but also against the state. And we talked about similarly how in medicine, people can use religion as a medicinal tool, but also it can be used as an inverse as well. So we're going to be talking about that as time moves on more and more. And so the obvious parallels, again, we're going over different researchers here. Leonard Peikoff, and he's an author, he goes into the roots of Nazism, right? We talked about Stanley Milgram experiments. Well, he said that if camps were set up in America today, there'd be sufficient personnel to fill the camps. We can totally have the same scenario happen right now in America as what happened not even 100 years ago. And that should shock a lot of people. Well, he identifies, this researcher here, the philosophical ideas that contributed to Nazism, and these include the worship of unreason, demand for self-sacrifice, and the elevation of society over the individual. And there's present-day relevance. He argues that these same ideas are present in America today, urging readers to be aware of the dangers they pose. And again, think for yourself on this, because it's about not repeating history. And if we look back, we see lots of war, we see a lot of democide, and we're trying to prevent that. We're trying to prevent the top cause of death. And similarly, when it comes to medicine, I would hope that we're trying to prevent illness and not have it reappear and having to create new drugs or new systems to try to fix all the problems that we then created later on. It's a mess. It becomes so messy. People are like, there's so many laws, there's so many medicines, what do I do? And I think that type of confusion and lack of control then just contributes more and more to that problem until it all kind of crashes down and people say, well, we got to rebuild and make a whole new system. It's very interesting because Nazism is growing out of this tyrannical other system. It's like, let's create a new ideology because this old system didn't work. So recognizing like why was that created and how did it become dangerous is important.
The common theme we're seeing here is that the society gains power over the individual and that the empowerment of the individual is ultimately the only thing that recovers that power for others as well. So when we're talking about, whether we're talking about healthcare or, civilization on whatever scale, we're looking at the value and power of the individual and the rights of the individual and how they relate to the overall society, and how that when that goes into severe imbalance, then we lose freedoms for all, not just the person, but for all the individuals in that society. So this is a very important point and a very common theme that we're looking at over and over again when we look at the totalitarian state or the undue influence of the corporations over governments and the individual, for example, in healthcare, the doctor and the empowerment of the doctor as a decision maker, and the power of the patient. So these are important themes.
And here you can see different comparisons of what we have today in America and have had throughout our history in the United States versus some of these totalitarian regimes. And the more you delve into this, you might realize there are quite a bit of parallels. that could concern some folks. For instance, pledging to a flag, pledging to a certain symbol, looking up to certain forms of authority in men or in symbols or in documents of different kinds or even in money, right? So it's all here laid out.
And this comes from Government, the Greatest Scam on Earth. Is that correct? By Etienne de la Boetie?
Yeah, his website is artofliberty.org. If anybody wants to check that out. He's got a lot of resources on there. And again, if you have an open mind to that knowledge, I find it particularly interesting to share because he's saying there are parallels between the systems of the past and now. So, coming from a psychology perspective, are we repeating our same mindsets that are going to lead to the same actions in the long scheme of things? We have to be very careful here. We know we set up Japanese camps in America. We know that we went over these different examples in history of mind control and MK Ultra, already quite scary stuff. But can it get to an even bigger scale? Has it already been there? Right? I mean, there's questions to ask. Well, something that might come to mind as well among this is the 4 stages of ideological subversion, and this was shared by an ex-KGB Soviet, Yuri Bezmenov. And you can look up this interview online, actually. And he shares with us the psychological warfare used in different countries. And he says it goes through several processes. There's demoralization, destabilization, crises, and then normalization. And he says demoralization, that process is irreversible, and it aims to change the perception of reality for every American. So that's a psychological warfare tactic. I mean, let me know if that's wrong, but I'm pretty sure that is, telling people, what is right and what is wrong, what they should accept as good to uphold and what they should not. And that could create an us versus them dynamic, I'm sure. But despite an abundance of information, individuals become unable to draw sensible conclusions in defense of themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a 15 to 20-year process, as that is the minimum number of years it takes to re-educate one generation of students. And then after demoralization, the second stage involves destabilization. During this phase, the existing systems, such as the economy, foreign relations, and defense, are undermined and weakened. That's a 2 to 5 year period. Then the third stage is marked by a violent change in power, structure, and economy. It represents a critical point where instability reaches its peak, and that takes about 6 weeks. That's when a country is basically taken over, living under a new ideology and reality. Then finally, normalization occurs, a period of relative stability until the next cycle reaches a crisis point. The cyclical process continues, perpetrating ideological subversion. How one populace becomes ingrained into a whole new ideology, essentially. How do you do that? You have to start with a demoralization and a destabilization, right? We talked about confusion, not knowing who we are, and then being dependent on external things to us. Despite the abundance of information, he says, though, individuals become unable to draw conclusions. So maybe there is, too much information, or maybe the right information is being censored or attacked, like we talked about before. Right? There's a lot that can go on within that process of demoralization. It's a 15 to 20-year process.
Yeah. And I would say that where we currently are in November of 2024, November 9th, that seem to be experiencing a great destabilization. I think that we can find evidence for having this first stage of demoralization already in place, and now lots of destabilization going on. And so, I think we need to be very careful about the potential, the crisis. It's on the horizon, and how we can be prepared for that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly mention this return to truth not being complicated. At some point, the truth connects us back to the simple and the sacred. And it seems as though now we have gotten too high on our own supply of taking something that is complicated, but making it, let's say taking something that's complex and making it extra complicated. It's like somehow we're getting off on the complications of everything.
Yeah.
Yes, it is complex, but we have to still remember that ideally we want to try to move towards what's simple and sacred and true. But at this point in time, it seems that much of humanity doesn't know what the truth is any longer. We've disconnected from our hearts, our souls. We don't have a relationship between the hemispheres of the brain. Men and women are still separated and divided more than ever. And this is what's keeping us from understanding the truth, and which connects us back to natural law, the simple and the sacred.
Yeah. And to share with the audience here what you mean by natural law is morality, right? In many, many ways. A lot of people have used this throughout history to mean some sort of moral law or fabric within the universe, an understanding of who we are, and knowing those effects to our actions. So we know that we can create order versus chaos, or good within our life versus evil, or perpetrating disease, right? Or any sense of illness. So, it's not perhaps a coincidence that morality and disease or illness have gone hand in hand throughout history. And perhaps why religion is often correlated to both, both healing and morality, when it doesn't necessarily have to be the source of that, which is why terms like natural law have been developed. But I think that connection might help us as we move forward here.
Corey, it's coherence. When you're in a state of coherence, the body will function more optimally. And again, there is a mind-body connection. So if you're confused, you're disorganized, you're discombobulated mentally, it's going to cascade into your hormonal system, your gut, your nervous system, your immune system, and everything that we're seeing externally is contributing to the discombobulation of our mind. So unless you have, or you're working towards your sovereign state of finding your truth, the truth aligning with your heart, your soul, and morality, it's just a perfect recipe for illness, mental and physical, which the institution loves because they capitalize and off of us being sick, sadly.
Whether it's a capital gain or even a power gain, right? I mean, some people might have so much money. It's not about money. It's more about power and ego, and maybe trying to fulfill those inner childhood things that they're missing. And so the leader is projecting onto the people, and the people kind of feed that up as that leader appears charismatic and tries giving everything what the people want in their insecurities, right? So insecurity treating insecurity. It's like, oh my gosh, where are we? Trauma treating trauma. It can seem like that sometimes. Here's a quote from Yuri. He says, they are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern, alluding to Pavlov. You cannot change their mind even if you expose them to authentic information. Even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. I think what he's detailing here is the perfect tunneling of vision that I mentioned before, that lack of flexibility to see any other possible worldview or way of thinking.
So we should briefly mention what Pavlovian conditioning refers to. It refers to what they also call classical conditioning. And it's when one stimulus is paired with a natural stimulus. So in Pavlov's example, he noticed that when you put food down, when you held the dog food bowl, the dogs will salivate. And then he decided to ring a bell at the same time that he held the dog food for the dogs. And then he took away the dog food and he just rang the bell, and he noticed the dogs would salivate too, because they associated the bell with the food. And so here is this very deeply conditioned association in that individual's mind and their nervous system, where you no longer need to have food, you just need to ring bells, and then you get the automatic response. So it's a way that humans can be conditioned as well through association.
Thank you for expanding on that, Leslie. And so more on this idea of proof and how it will not be effective. And you might relate this to the left brain as well, sharing all the facts and being super analytical, not necessarily reaching the heart or that right brain. Well, here he says, as I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who is demoralized is unable to access or assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him a concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he receives a kick in his fan bottom. When a military boat crashes his balls, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragedy of the situation of demoralization. And then he says, if people will fail to grasp the impending danger of that development, nothing ever can help the United States. And he added that you may kiss goodbye to your freedom. So quite a warning statement to the world saying, man, if you do not recognize that you're being demoralized, you're not getting to the root cause, essentially, of why you're not free, of why you're in the scenario that you're in. And Stephanie, tell me if I'm wrong here, but when we're talking about morality and accessing more of that heart-based care, isn't that like the right brain, feminine, as opposed to like the masculine of information, just trying to shower everybody with all the facts and analytics?
Yeah, I would definitely say that. Again, we've been conditioned so brilliantly by the engineers who are benefiting off of this sort of control that it's almost a slow burn, that the conditioning has just been so precise to just slowly disconnect somebody from their conscious and their heart. And the way back to the heart is painful. There's a quote, I'm not going to quote it exactly, but it says the longest journey that somebody will ever take is the 17 inches between their mind and their heart. So, I mean, this is something, ancient wisdom traditions such as the chakra system is breaking through the lower nature of the first three chakras, which are survival, fear, working through shame and guilt of your past. And then that third chakra actually sits in the seat of your gut, which is your conscience, and which is what you have to overcome and face for you to transform. The gut is the transformational boundary to that eventually you break through to get you into the heart, which then you can start to connect the heart with your true ability to speak your truth and to connect with that divinity, with the potential that humans all have when they're operating from a more balanced state of their heart and their mind together. It's an incredible journey. It's a life journey to break into the heart. So we need more people sharing the benefits of doing that very powerful, very complicated self-work. We need people to share the information.
Well, what you just said right there, share the information, and you're sharing with us the information. Is that enough to share this perspective? Because as he just said, not enough information does not matter. And it's like morality seems to kind of be separate here from the information. So can it really be portrayed right now through the words that you're using, or is it perhaps through certain practices?
So the feminine component is we can just say reductionistically that the left brain or the masculine would be connected to consciousness and information and knowledge. And the feminine is actually the embodiment of the information, which is consciousness, where consciousness really starts to develop, and love and energy becomes very renewable and self-sustainable when you do that. So the issue is, I think what may be being shown here in this slide is that until you embody it, which is the process of integrating the divine mother, your feminine, your heart, and you have to deeply embody that. And that requires you to heal the nature of relationships that you may have that keep you out of your heart. You have to face your ego. You have to face all of your fears. And in order to do that, this information settles into the body. And we call that embodiment, or what's connected to somatic therapies. And in fact, I just saw a quote, I believe it was by Gabor Mate, who's a pioneer in the world of trauma work. No, it wasn't actually. It was a Jungian analyst, was saying that we are about to step into the most profound somatic distortion within our illness community that we have ever seen. it's going that the next stage of need for healing in the world is going to come through why we are stuck in our embodiment process. And that's going to have to come with not just information and psychotherapy and mind, CBT, mind related therapy. It's going to have to come through the body, which are in those more Eastern perspectives that we see of yoga, karate, martial arts, qigong. That is what's going to help us to compassionately break into the heart and embody the information.
I think this slide also talks to the experience of cognitive dissonance, where we are in internal conflict, right, between what we see and what we interpret, how we interpret what we see, and the rigid, calcified, stubborn holding on to beliefs. And I think it's important that people ask themselves where their automatic thoughts and their beliefs come from. How were they created? What's the origin story of their belief systems? Because at the base of that is a story that generally falls into our own childhood experience of relationship and safety. And that involves that Pavlovian classical conditioning of having emotional attachments to things being a certain way, which by clinging to our sense of safety, we refuse to see the truth of what's in front of us. So again, this points to the importance of our inner work so that we don't voluntarily walk ourselves into slaughter of some sort.
Wow. Well said. Thank you guys for expanding on this. And what would be important here, since we're talking about different potentials within not just this country, but what has happened already in history, we can look at the writings of George Orwell, right? That might come to mind. His famous book, 1984, or even Aldous Huxley, who basically expanded on that. Both these authors have unique perspectives on this that are shared here in this slide, predicting essentially the future or, some aspects of our past as we see these traumas and these ideas tend to resurface. Well, here we have a quote: "A really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which the all-powerful executive of political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude." And then here's another quote: "Within the next generation, I believe that the world's rulers will discover that infant conditioning and narco-hypnosis are more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, and that the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people into loving their servitude as by flogging and kicking them into obedience." In other words, I feel that the nightmare of 1984 is destined to modulate into the nightmare of a world having more resemblance to that which I imagined in Brave New World. The change will be brought about as a result of a felt need for increased efficiency. Meanwhile, of course, there may be a large-scale biological and atomic war, in which case we shall have nightmares of other and scarcely imaginable kinds.
Stephanie, doesn't this remind you of the situation you faced in New York City, where you were seeking financial support for patient-based care? And a lot of that was, instead of helping the direct service of patients, was put into technology. So a lot of these hospitals and companies are really eager for increased efficiency through technology, but not open as much to invest in direct care.
Because I've come to realize, and obviously I might be missing part of this, but through my very in-depth experience and research, is that the consciousness is actually lacking within those who are providing the care, and that they actually cannot see the benefit of developing consciousness and energy and the integration of the feminine perspective and how the two can work and in harmony and really benefit each other. The consciousness is not awakened yet. So they're their only reality to try to solve problems from hopefully the good intention that they still have to help patients is through technology. They feel that that is the only way because they cannot see yet. Their eye has not been opened.
And from this vantage point, from the perspective of a clinical practitioner, a clinician as myself, there's this increasing disconnect between the technology that's getting created and what's actually good for the therapeutic process and good for the patient. Yeah.
I think, again, it all comes down to understanding that there's a spectrum and we need to try to work towards a balance. But when people don't even see the two ends of the spectrum clearly, it's very difficult to get there, Leslie. You're absolutely right. We should be utilizing the best aspects of tech along with the best aspects of helping people to understand and develop their own energy and heal their trauma and how they're thinking. And these should be coupled. Consciousness and tech should be working side by side, not completely decoupled from each other.
Yes. I'd like to say that, I mean, that is the prime example of my work on natural intelligence. If people are interested, I wrote a book alongside several world leaders in different industries talking about agriculture, but delving deeper into that is the mindset. And we called it natural intelligence, basically that consciousness that you're describing, Stephanie, as opposed to the technology. But they're not in opposition to each other by default because technology was created due to our intelligence and due to bringing all these different ideas of nature together. The problem is when they're not working together, when your natural intelligence or your consciousness is being undermined or replaced. You know, we become tools of our tools. We're not using our tools consciously. The tools start using us unconsciously. And that's where we have to be quite careful. At least that's what I detail in the natural intelligence book for those of you who are interested. So this idea here of mental servitude, which we keep detailing through numerous different perspectives you see now as a pattern, Aldous Huxley shares more. He says a happy slave is no longer human. And this could relate to technology and robotics, perhaps. According to Huxley, about 20% of people are easily hypnotized, while 20% are very difficult, if not impossible, to hypnotize. The remaining 60%, the majority, can be gradually hypnotized if you work hard enough at it. And Frederick Douglass, I shared a quote from here, from him, since he is a former slave and abolitionist. And of course, you know, I talk a lot about slavery and abolitionism and the history within my works. He says, when a slave becomes a happy slave, he has effectively relinquished all that makes him human. So I see a direct parallel with what Huxley is saying here. How if you become conditioned and you believe your condition is so right and necessary, I mean, even if it's not actually right, you start thinking it's right and you don't become human anymore because you're not following what is right, but you accept it as if it is. You take what is unnatural and you completely accept it as natural, and there's no question so as to if it is. You're not conscious, as we mentioned before.
You begin to succumb to entropy. I mean, this world has an incredible entropic force. And the reality is that the way things are, you have to work up and out against it constantly. So when you are just oppressed and you are not doing your inner work and you are buying into the cultural narrative, if you are just, I mean, really at this point in time, I can't say enough that I believe it's the inner work and our reconnection with our soul that's going to save us. And you have to fight up and out of where you are. That's just how it is, no matter where you're at. If you're sick, if you're tired, if you're economically challenged, resourcefully challenged, already mentally ill and stressed, you're still going to have to find it within you to try to work yourself up and out of this.
And so let's share more different perspectives. And again, you know, we're going to tie a lot of this together as we move on. Bullying. Well, there's a book called Bullyocracy by Donald Jeffries. The school authorities are contributing to the problem, he says. Students and adults both uphold the status quo. He says, this is a quote, in an increasing number of cases, the teachers are not mere disinterested and competent spectators. They are the bullies. Just as schools boast of zero tolerance policies against bullying while doing everything they can to minimize and ignore it, police departments and other government agencies publicly encourage whistleblowing, but in practice severely punish the whistleblowers. So going back to this idea of the disconnect, the lack of consistency. We have morals, we know what is right as opposed to wrong. Most people generally do, but there's this superstition or these ideas and these systems that make us feel as though we're obligated not to follow what we intuitively know and to not do what is right, but actually do the complete opposite. In certain cases, in certain times, there's certain exceptions. Go ahead.
It's like the phrase, do what I say, not what I do, and it's happening at the level of parent to child, teacher to student, police to citizen, Don't bully, but I'm going to bully you, and it's okay because, I'm in authority.
Yeah.
I think we saw that play out radically recently in healthcare too. Some of our greatest healthcare authorities that we have had were appearingly, obviously not healthy. And what a contradiction, what a cognitive dissonance that poses. I'm supposed to listen to this authority, but you yourself are not healthy. It's just completely messes with the mind.
And also stepping into the role of telling certain people that they are spreading bad information, that they're wrong, they need to be silenced, right? There's all sorts of violation of, even common courtesy, here, treating each other not as equals, peers, or humans.
Yeah, like boasting tolerance when you might be like the least tolerant person, and that's why you have to boast tolerance, right? It's like, why are you saying that you're all so virtuous and so great? Maybe it's because you're trying to fulfill something within yourself. You're trying to reach that identity that you've looked for as a child, to be recognized by your own parents or by your community. And so you're finding anything to latch onto to sort of project in a way. And so, there's a lot of purposes people have attained in this world, and some of it can be bullying, some of it can be modern day slavery, some of it can be fixing healthcare systems. But can people see the trends and patterns within all these different systems through the fact that they're all, through different hierarchies, sharing this idea of the authority figure, and seeing how the individual may not be thinking for themselves in each and every single case? So like we're challenging authority on every single level here, although of course we're looking at state authority in particular the most. These are important because, as we mentioned, childhood contributes to the adulthood, and that carries with them. A book that might come to mind, since we're talking about morality relatively often here, is Richard Wetherell's book, Right is Might. And he basically shares with us that contrary to the idea that might makes right, is the idea that right is might. It is the principle that doing what is right leads to right results, while wrong actions lead to problems and failures. Wetherell states it is a natural law of behaviors that individuals must think, say, and do what is right to achieve positive outcomes. This law is self-enforcing. Deviations from right behavior result in internal conflict and negative consequences. Strategies can be applied, such as self-reflection, decision-making, and communication, that help individuals consistently choose right actions. These practices can lead to more harmonious relationships and greater personal satisfaction. Understanding and applying this principle on a mass scale can lead to a better, more harmonious world. And there's a lot of books like this that are basic ethical behavior type books, but this one was a particular one that I found quite interesting. Saying here's a natural law that can apply in every circumstance, where he's not specifically defining what is right, but he's saying what is right leads to right. It's like a very basic understanding. And it's like, oh, interesting. Okay. And then he often within his work emphasizes honesty, and being really true to yourself. And we'll see that as a common trend upon reading Carl Jung and Alan Watts and other figures, as well as that idea of honesty as a moral rule within itself, or the golden rule.
Back to the sacred and simple is that the principles we need to try to abide by is truth and goodness. Truth and goodness.
Yeah. So after reviewing different topics, different researchers among the lines of statism, we have this common trend in the question of authority. And many books speak about the problems of corrupt authorities or corrupt systems, totalitarian, authoritarian systems. But the question that may come to mind based on studying Larkin Rose and his work is, what about the whole notion of authority itself? If we're trying to get to the root cause of the problem, and we are looking at many different trends that we see with authoritarianism, and we're looking at behavior and the mind, it might help to look at that whole notion of authority itself, rather than, what is the authority doing? The perception of the people creating that authority in man, that identity in the very first place, just like we talked about with creating a diagnosis and a certain label or title, that itself can do different effects. But we might look at the result of that, different aspects of it, but not address it directly. So we're not just challenging, what's corrupt authorities or what the authorities are doing, but the whole notion of authority itself. Because are you the authority of yourself, right? Are you in control of yourself? So this is just a question we're going to leave you off here for our next part. So thank you very much for joining us for part 2, and be sure to join us for part 3, where we delve deeper into that question and we get clearer on the solution.
This night work's kind of rough, isn't it? That's right. But a camel's always a pleasure.
Yes, folks, the pleasing mildness of a camel is just as enjoyable to a doctor as it is to you or me. In a nationwide survey, doctors in all branches of medicine were asked what were included. And according to this nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Try Camels yourself, the cigarette so many doctors enjoy. What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?
Tens of thousands of doctors in all branches of medicine, in all parts of the country, were asked that question.
What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?
The brand named most was Camel. Yes, surveys show more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette.
Smoke Camels, the cigarette so many doctors enjoy.
Gang sign? Have you,
Oh, like you don't know what it is. You don't know what that is.
I have no idea.
Well, you don't know. Jimmy Fallon doesn't know. David Letterman doesn't know.
We don't know.
All the comics and show business don't know what this is. I'm here tonight to blow the lid off it, to be the whistleblower. I'm sick and tired of the secrets and the lies. It is the secret symbol of the Illuminati, and you're a part of it, and it is the all-mocking tongue. For years now, talk show hosts, people on television, people in sitcoms have been hired by the government to throw you off the track, to distract you, to make you laugh and stuff like that, make you happy and docile so you don't know what's really going on. And they get out there in the woods in a circle naked and they decide these things. You know what they're trying to do? Who? This thing is buzzing. Hold on. They're trying to turn us into, consumer drones of some sort. Hold on, I just got to get this. Yeah, listen, I'm in the middle of blowing the lid off some...
What happened?
I'm sorry, Jimmy. I was temporarily interrupted by my iPhone 6 Plus.
Well, people, Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky, those people aren't on TV because they have intellect and they're dissenters, and the limits of debate in this country are set before the debate begins. These people will not be included. The debate will take place between these two poles, and we'll have them on Ted Koppel, and it's an argument between sames. I mean, it's the same thing. It's just little variations. The people who are outside are quickly marginalized. They're made to be either subversive, made out to be either subversive or kooks. The owners of the country they got their election. They said, we're going to get this election. We put you people in that court for a reason.
All right,
now's the
back
time
to earth for you now.
Yeah, forget all that stupid. Will you? They're out in the open. They're openly driving the bus, and we're all in the back.
There is no national conspiracy to buy elections and control America. Now talk about back to earth. That's part of the problem.
You don't need a formal conspiracy when interests converge. These people went to the same universities and fraternities. They're on the same boards of directors. They're in the same country clubs. They have like interests. They don't need to call a meeting. They know what's good for them, and they're getting it. And there used to be 7 oil companies. There are now 3. It will soon be 2. The things that matter in this country have been reduced in choice. There are 2 political parties. There are a handful of insurance companies. There are about 6 or 7 information imitation thing. But if you want a bagel, there are 23 flavors because you have the illusion. You have the illusion of choice. Right. You don't get the real important choice. There's no freedom of choice.
Forget the politicians. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. Beating you over the head in their media, telling you what to believe, what to think, and what to buy. The table is tilted, folks. The game is rigged. And nobody seems to notice. Nobody seems to care. Good, honest, hard-working people. White collar, blue collar, doesn't matter what color shirt you have on.